It started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my favorite corner table in a small, bustling cafe when I first noticed him. At first glance, he seemed like any other customer, a quiet man with neatly combed hair and a mild, almost apologetic smile. I was busy scrolling through my phone when our eyes met briefly, and I recall a fleeting moment of recognition, as if I'd seen him somewhere before. I dismissed it as a trick of my tired mind, nothing more than an innocent glance between strangers. A few days later, while running errands at a local grocery store, I found myself pausing in the produce aisle. There, standing at the far end, was the same man. He was examining a stack of apples with the same careful deliberation, and when our eyes met, his smile returned, slightly wider, almost too knowing. I felt a chill, an inexplicable prickle along my arms. But again, I reassured myself that it was merely coincidence. Perhaps I was just imagining connections that weren't really there. Over the next week, his appearances grew more frequent. I spotted him during my morning jog in the park, always at the same stretch of trail where the trees formed a quiet corridor. Sometimes he was alone. Other times he lingered near the benches as if waiting for someone. At first, his presence seemed benign, even comforting in a strange way, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in my daily routines. But the frequency soon became unnerving. One evening, while I was waiting for the bus, I noticed him standing several feet away, his gaze fixed on me. His posture was relaxed, his expression calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that belied his placid exterior. The real turning point came one rainy night. I had just left a friend's apartment and was walking briskly under the sparse glow of streetlights when I caught sight of him again, this time outside my building. He stood in the dim puddle of light at the entrance, his figure half-shadowed by the overhanging awning. I felt as though he were silently cataloging my every move. My pulse raced and I quickened my pace, barely daring to look back. When I reached my door, I fumbled with my keys, glancing through the peephole repeatedly. There was no sign of him inside, but the unsettling feeling that I was being observed persisted long into the night. Strange coincidences began to pile up. A week later, I found a small, unmarked envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single slip of paper bearing only the words, "I see you." I was too shaken to call the police, fearing it might escalate the situation or even confirm my worst suspicions. Instead, I confided in a close friend, who assured me that it was likely a prank or the work of someone with a twisted sense of humor. Still, every time I stepped out, my eyes darted to every shadow and every passerby, wondering if he might be lurking just out of sight. In an attempt to understand what was happening, I began retracing my steps, mentally noting every encounter with him. His behavior was never overtly threatening. He would sometimes approach me with small talk, a comment about the weather, a compliment on my scarf, or even a question about my work routine. Each interaction was laced with a subtle, almost imperceptible intensity, as if he were trying to glean personal details. When I mentioned these encounters to colleagues, they shrugged it off, suggesting I was simply overreacting to a friendly stranger. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was caught in the middle of something far more disturbing. My anxiety escalated to the point where I began to alter my daily habits. I took different routes to work, avoided my usual cafe, and started leaving home earlier than necessary. Yet, no matter what precautions I took, there was always a glimpse of him. A shadow in a shop window, a reflection in a passing car, or even his silhouette in the background of a crowded street. It was as if he was following me, orchestrating these encounters with deliberate precision. Late one evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, I decided to venture out to clear my head. I walked through the quiet streets, the city's hum a distant murmur. That's when I saw him again, sitting on a bench under a flickering street lamp. This time, he wasn't standing by. He was seated calmly, almost waiting for me. As I hesitated at a distance, he looked up and caught my eye. His expression was unreadable, but for a moment I felt a cold certainty that he knew something about me that I didn't. I turned and walked away quickly, my heart pounding in my ears. Now, each day has become a balance between mundane routine and a pervasive sense of dread. I find myself scrutinizing every passerby, every friendly smile, wondering if they might be complicit or if they, too, are being drawn into an unknown agenda. I've scoured social media and local news for any mention of a missing person or a series of similar encounters, but nothing concrete emerges. Only vague mentions of odd sightings that no one seems to take seriously. I write these words with a lingering tremor in my hand, trying to document every detail in hopes that someday I might piece together a coherent picture. The man's repeated appearances have begun to take a toll on my mental state. I am constantly alert, unable to relax even in the supposed safety of my home. It feels as though I am caught in the middle of an obsessive plan, where I am both the target and the unwilling participant. I still don't know who he is or why he keeps reappearing. Was it all an elaborate coincidence? Or is someone truly watching me, orchestrating these encounters with meticulous care? The unanswered questions gnaw at me in the silence of the night. Every creak, every reflection, every stray glimpse of a familiar face leaves me wondering, am I merely paranoid, or is there something more sinister at work? I always thought my days unfolded in a comforting pattern. Wake up, brew coffee, leave for work, return home, and settle into an evening routine. But one seemingly ordinary Tuesday, I noticed something that set off a slow, creeping disquiet. As I reached into my kitchen cabinet for my favorite mug, the one with a small, familiar chip along its rim, I found it perfectly smooth, its chipped edge gone without a trace. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was mistaken, but deep down I sensed that something was off. Later that morning, on my way to the office, I passed a car parked by the curb that I was sure I'd never seen before. Its paint was an odd, almost synthetic blue, and the license plate number glinted in a way that made me pause. I noted it mentally, dismissing it as an unusual car I hadn't noticed until now. But by lunchtime, the same car appeared again, idling in the same spot near the building entrance, its presence as persistent as a glitch in a video game. I asked a co-worker if she'd seen it, but she only smiled and said, "That car's always been here," though I was certain it wasn't. When I returned home that evening, I found the living room arranged exactly as I'd left it. Every cushion, every framed photograph, every little trinket was in place. Yet, a few hours later, while I was idly flipping through TV channels, I glanced at the coffee table, and there it was again, my favorite mug, sitting in the exact same spot as when I had just passed through the door. I hadn't touched it. It was as if it had simply reappeared in the same position, repeated for a second time. The repetition unsettled me, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Over the next few days, these small anomalies multiplied. I noticed that every morning, as I left for work, I would catch sight of the same sedan parked at a particular angle, its tires leaving faint, fresh marks on the pavement that vanished by afternoon. In the office, the clock on the wall would sometimes skip a few seconds backward, only to resume its forward march as if nothing had happened. I began to record these moments, scribbling notes in a journal and snapping photos with my phone. But when I reviewed them later, the images were either blurry or showed no evidence of any irregularity. It was as if the world was editing itself just out of my reach. At home, I started to notice that objects I was certain I had arranged a certain way seemed to inexplicably shift positions during the night. One morning, a framed photograph that had hung crookedly on the wall was perfectly straight, even though I hadn't touched it. My keys, which I always placed in a small dish by the door, were sometimes missing from that spot, only to be found later in exactly the same position, as if they had never left. The feeling was disconcerting, a quiet, persistent sensation that my environment was repeating itself in subtle, unaccountable ways. Then came the strange repetitions of people. I was on my regular evening walk through the neighborhood when I passed a woman walking her dog. I distinctly remembered her from the previous day, but she was wearing a different coat, and her dog had an unusual, almost mechanical gait. I tried to engage her in conversation, but she offered only a curt nod before moving on, as if she were unaware of our prior encounter. At the grocery store, I saw a man at the produce section whose face I recognized from a meeting at work. Yet he was speaking in a tone I'd never heard from him before, and his mannerisms were off, rehearsed, almost as if he were acting out a part. The small glitches began to blur the line between a peculiar coincidence and something far more systematic. I started to feel as though my surroundings were being subtly rewritten, like a computer program stuck in a loop. Each anomaly, the misplaced mug, the recurring car, the shifting objects, seemed like a tiny piece of a larger, incomprehensible puzzle. I began to wonder if my entire reality was nothing more than a simulation, a programmed environment where details could be edited and replayed without my consent. One evening, after another long day of inexplicable events, I sat alone in my dim living room, the quiet punctuated by the soft hum of the refrigerator. I stared at the coffee table, where my mug sat exactly as it had that morning, unchanged despite my numerous glances throughout the day. In that moment, the weight of every anomaly pressed down on me. I felt as if I were no longer simply observing these glitches. I was part of them, woven into a tapestry of repeated moments and unexplained changes. I recalled the recurring image of that strange car, the woman's altered appearance, the keys that disappeared only to reappear, and it all coalesced into a single, disquieting thought. Perhaps everything I had ever known was just an illusion, a fabricated reality subject to unseen edits and corrections. The realization grew in intensity until it was impossible to ignore. I started questioning whether my memories were truly mine, or if they, too, were subject to periodic revisions. What if my sense of self was nothing more than a series of programmed responses in a world that was constantly being reset? As I sat there, lost in a spiral of thoughts that blurred time and space, I could no longer tell whether these glitches were random errors or deliberate modifications, a system recalibrating itself without my participation. In the final moments of that night, as I looked out the window at a street bathed in the same pale light as always, I felt an overwhelming sense of resignation. The familiar had become unreliable, and every repeated detail was a reminder that nothing was truly constant. The fabric of my world was fraying, revealing the possibility that reality might be fake, a carefully orchestrated simulation in which I was merely a character. And as I wrestled with that terrifying thought, I realized I might never return to the steady, predictable life I once knew. Instead, I had become part of the glitch, a permanent, unresolvable error in a matrix that no longer made sense. In the end, I couldn't tell if it even mattered, because when reality is nothing more than a loop of repeated moments, the truth becomes as elusive as the next glitch waiting just around the corner. I moved into the apartment on Willow Lane in late October, thinking that a change of scenery would help me start fresh. The building was older, with creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways that carried a faint, musty scent. At first, everything felt normal, if a bit dated, but as the weeks passed, I began noticing small things that didn't quite add up. It started with a coffee mug I always left on the side table in the kitchen. One morning, I poured my coffee as usual, and on my way to the living room, I glanced back and saw the mug in a completely different spot, resting atop the bookshelf instead of its regular place. I rubbed my eyes, sure I'd just misplaced it, but the mug remained exactly where I hadn't put it. At work, I encountered a similar dissonance. My coworker Mark, who I'd known for years, greeted me with a puzzled look the day after I mentioned the misplaced mug. "I'm pretty sure you left your mug in the break room yesterday," he insisted. I remembered it clearly on my kitchen table that morning. His tone was gentle, but his certainty unsettled me. I tried to brush it off as a simple lapse in memory, yet an inexplicable chill lingered as if someone, or something, was altering the details of my day without my consent. Then came the notes. One evening, after a long day that left me exhausted, I returned to my apartment to find a small piece of paper on the kitchen counter. It read only, "Watch closely." I assumed it was a prank or perhaps the work of a mischievous neighbor, but when I mentioned it to Mrs. Alvarez from next door, she merely smiled politely and said, "Strange things happen around here, dear." Her vague response did nothing to ease my growing unease. Over the next few weeks, the subtle changes multiplied. I began to notice that objects in my home would shift positions overnight. A book moved from the coffee table to the mantel. A lamp turned off when I was sure I'd left it on. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. For just a moment, my reflection seemed to lag behind my movements, as if it were controlled by a delayed signal. I stared, heart pounding, only to see it snap back into sync as soon as I blinked. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if something was truly wrong. The most unsettling moment came one rainy evening. I had just returned from work and was settling into my favorite armchair when I noticed that the clock on the wall was displaying a time that I didn't recall. I distinctly remembered it being 9:15, but the clock read 8:47. I checked my phone, and it confirmed that it was indeed 9:15. I felt a rising panic mixed with a deep, unexplainable dread. It was as if minutes, maybe even hours, were being stolen from my day, lost to a force that I couldn't see or understand. Then the changes began to affect the people around me. My longtime friend Sarah, who always joked about my meticulous nature, started behaving oddly during our conversations. She would mention details of our past that I was certain we'd never discussed. Memories that weren't mine, but felt eerily familiar. When I questioned her about it, she looked away and said, "You must be tired. Let's talk later." At work, other colleagues seemed to have forgotten things we had just discussed, as if our shared moments had evaporated into thin air. Every time I tried to bring up these discrepancies, I was met with blank stares or polite dismissals, as though I were the only one noticing that reality was shifting. I began keeping a journal, writing down every inexplicable event in hopes of finding a pattern, a logical explanation that could tether me to the truth of what was happening. I documented the repositioned objects, the altered memories, and even the faint whisper of voices I sometimes caught in the dead of night when the building was silent. My entries grew more frantic as I noticed that even my writing seemed to change from one day to the next. Words I had written with certainty would reappear later in my notebook with slight alterations, as if someone or something had been editing my thoughts. One night, while reviewing my journal by the dim light of my desk lamp, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible tapping at my window. I peered through the curtains and saw nothing but the relentless patter of rain. Yet the tapping persisted, a rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse with the beating of my heart. I felt an overwhelming sense that I was being watched from within my own home, a presence that wasn't physical but somehow infused into the very air around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that every familiar corner of my apartment harbored a secret. Every mundane detail was a clue to a puzzle I was meant to solve. As the weeks turned into months, my life became a series of disjointed moments, a continuous loop of normalcy punctuated by these bizarre, unsettling anomalies. I tried to maintain a sense of routine, but every time I closed my eyes, I woke up to a world that wasn't quite the same as the one I remembered. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if these occurrences were the product of stress, isolation, or something far more sinister. I reached out to friends and even sought professional help, but no one else seemed to notice the changes. They reassured me that everything was normal, that I was simply overreacting to a few coincidences. But I knew what I felt, what I saw, and it wasn't a trick of the light or a lapse in memory. It was real. One chilly night, as I sat in the silence of my apartment, I made a chilling discovery. I found a photograph on my doorstep, a picture of my living room taken from outside, capturing every piece of furniture in perfect detail. The strange part was that the photograph wasn't taken from any angle I recognized, and in the background, through the window, I saw a shadowy figure that I knew wasn't mine. The image sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized with dawning horror that I wasn't just losing time or having my surroundings altered. I was being drawn into a mystery that defied all logic. It wasn't mere coincidence. It was as if an unseen force was orchestrating these changes, manipulating reality piece by piece. Now, as I write these words in the quiet hours of the night, I'm left with more questions than answers. I have tried to cling to the memory of a world that once felt secure, but every day, I am confronted with the unsettling truth that nothing is as it seems. My apartment, my friends, even my own recollections have become unreliable, as if I were trapped in a reality that resets and shifts when I'm not looking. I don't know if I'll ever escape this web of inexplicable changes or if I'm destined to live in a world that is both familiar and completely alien. All I know is that the sense of normalcy I once took for granted has been shattered, replaced by a haunting awareness that something far darker and more inexplicable is at work. And in that lingering terror, I am left wondering if I'm truly alone in seeing it, or if I become a pawn in a game I can neither comprehend nor control. I moved into my first apartment in the city last summer, excited for a fresh start and a little independence. The place was modest, a small, two-bedroom on a quiet side street, but it felt like a sanctuary after years of cramped living. The first few weeks were ordinary. Work, grocery runs, and evenings spent reading on the threadbare couch. Then, one night, something inexplicable shattered that normalcy. I was lying in bed when I heard soft, deliberate footsteps outside my door. I told myself it was the building settling, or perhaps a stray animal wandering by. Yet, as the footsteps receded, a quiet whisper echoed, too clear to be imagined. "I see you." I froze, heart pounding, convinced I must have misheard. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. At first, the oddities were small. A book I was sure I'd left on the coffee table was later found on the kitchen counter. My keys, which I distinctly remembered placing in a bowl by the door, were inexplicably on the windowsill the next morning. I mentioned these incidents to a neighbor, who offered a tight smile and a dismissive shrug. I began to question my own memory, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But the mounting evidence was hard to ignore. Soon, I started receiving phone calls at odd hours. Calls that held nothing but silence, punctuated by a low, rhythmic tapping that sent chills through my body. One chilly evening, I returned home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, small items had been rearranged. A framed photo now hung crooked on the wall, and a cherished scarf lay folded on the floor in a spot I didn't remember. My heart raced as I checked every lock, every window, but found no sign of forced entry. I called the police, who shrugged off my concerns, citing no evidence of a break-in. Yet, the feeling of violation persisted, as if an unseen presence had been watching my every move. Over the following weeks, the disturbances escalated. I began noticing a pattern. Every time I left the apartment, there was a lingering sense that someone had been there after me. At work, odd coincidences compounded my anxiety. A coworker mentioned seeing me leave at a time when I was sure I was still at the office. Strangers on the street would nod at me as if they recognized me. And on more than one occasion, I overheard snatches of conversation that referenced details of my day I'd never shared. One evening, while sitting in my favorite cafe, I looked up from my book to find a man in a dark coat watching me intently from a nearby table. His eyes held a peculiar glint, as if he knew things about me that I had never revealed. When I asked if he was a friend of someone I knew, he only smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and returned to his coffee. Then came the night that still haunts me. I awoke to a cold draft and the unmistakable sound of metal scraping on wood. Clad in a mix of terror and determination, I grabbed my flashlight and crept down to the basement, a space I rarely visited since it was filled with dusty boxes and forgotten memories. In the near darkness, I saw a door slightly ajar, though I was sure it had been locked. Compelled by a mix of dread and curiosity, I pushed it open and discovered a small envelope on the floor, addressed to me in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single slip of paper with a message that chilled me to the bone. "You cannot hide." As I stood there, frozen in disbelief, I heard footsteps behind me, deliberate and measured. I spun around, shining my light into the darkness, but there was nothing, only the echo of my own rapid breathing. I bolted back upstairs, slamming the basement door and checking every lock until my trembling fingers could no longer secure them. Even now, weeks after that night, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I've installed extra locks and even a security camera, yet nothing ever appears on the footage. The police continue to find no evidence of an intruder, and friends insist that I must be overreacting. But every creak of the floor, every whisper of whine through the window, forces me to relive that terrifying moment. I've come to believe that something inexplicable intruded into my life, something that defies logic and rational explanation. I know this isn't the work of an overactive imagination. It was real as the pounding of my heart and the cold sweat on my skin that night in the basement. I share this story not as a ghost tale spun for effect, but as a true account of an encounter that left me forever changed. I still wonder who or what was behind those subtle signs of intrusion, those carefully orchestrated details that made my sanctuary feel violated. No logical explanation has ever been found, and I remain haunted by the relentless question, why me? Every night, as I lock my door and settle into a restless sleep, I am reminded that something inexplicable, something terrifying, once stepped into my life, and it might be waiting for its next chance to strike. Ever since I moved into the crumbling brick building on the edge of town, life became a series of inexplicable horrors that I can scarcely recount without shuddering. I arrived on a chilly October evening, dismissing the neighbors' hushed warnings as local superstition. The building had an unsettling air, a palpable sadness, and the lingering scent of damp decay that I initially ignored as the quirks of an old structure. The first sign something was amiss came a week later, when I noticed an odd reflection in the hallway mirror. In the dim light, behind my own pale face, a gaunt figure flickered for just a moment before vanishing. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but a creeping dread took root in my mind. Soon, strange noises began to punctuate the silence of my nights. Soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the corridors, as if someone were methodically knocking on a door that wasn't there. I'd wake from restless sleep to find my apartment door slightly ajar, the wood bearing strange, scratch-like marks I couldn't explain. Once, while returning from a late shift, I heard an almost inaudible whisper calling my name from the shadows. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart hammering, but when I turned, nothing was visible, only an oppressive darkness that swallowed the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Things escalated when I discovered a series of faded, hand-drawn symbols etched onto the peeling wallpaper in my bedroom. At first, I assumed they were remnants from a previous tenant, but their arrangement seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. Night after night, I began to experience disturbing dreams in which I wandered endless, labyrinthine halls, pursued by indistinct figures whose faces were obscured by shifting shadows. The dreams bled into my waking hours. I would catch fleeting glimpses of those same figures in the corners of my vision, only for them to dissolve into nothingness when I tried to focus. One stormy night, the true horror revealed itself. A violent gust of wind slammed my door shut, trapping me in a sudden and suffocating darkness. The power flickered and died, leaving me in near total blackness save for the intermittent lightning that illuminated the room with ghostly clarity. In one such flash, I saw a spectral procession moving slowly down the hallway, a line of pale, expressionless faces, their eyes vacant yet intensely sorrowful, as if bearing witness to an ancient tragedy. I felt compelled to follow, though every instinct screamed to hide. As I trailed them, I found myself in a part of the building I'd never seen before, a narrow passage lined with old portraits whose eyes seemed to track my every move. The air was thick with despair and an inexplicable, choking presence. At the corridor's end, a door stood slightly open, emitting a faint, otherworldly glow. Inside, the room was lined with relics and mementos of lives long past. A single, dust-covered diary lay on an antique desk. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, chronicled the last days of a family whose fate had been sealed by inexplicable sorrow and unfathomable loss. As I flipped through the pages, I began to see parallels with my own life, the same sense of isolation, the same foreboding dread. The final entry was a frantic scrawl warning of a relentless presence that would one day claim another soul. At that moment, the temperature plummeted, and I could feel icy fingers brushing against my skin, though no one was there. Panic surged through me as I bolted from the room, desperate to escape the building's malevolent grip. I spent the following days in a haze of terror and disbelief, convinced that something otherworldly had attached itself to me. I attempted to leave, only to find that every exit was inexplicably sealed, as though the building itself had become a prison. Even now, as I write these words in a hastily rented motel room far away, I am haunted by the sensation of unseen eyes watching me, and the disembodied sound of that relentless tapping lingers in my mind. My attempts to share my story with friends or authorities have been met with incredulity. No one believes that a building can hold such dark, sentient malice. I still find remnants of that horror in my dreams. A fleeting image of a gaunt figure smiling in the dark, or a whispered warning that I have yet to heed. Some nights, I hear a familiar hum outside my window, a soft, mournful melody that seems to call me back to that cursed place. I do not know what lies within those walls, nor can I explain the pull that continues to tug at my soul. I fear that my fate was sealed long before I set foot in that building, and that I will never truly be free of its grasp. I now sit in silence, questioning the nature of reality and the boundaries between life and something far more sinister. Every creak of the floorboard in my new home, every whisper of wind against my window sends a chill down my spine. In the dead of night, when my thoughts wander back to that accursed building, I sense that the spectral presence may be watching me even from afar. It is as if I have become a magnet for the inexplicable, a beacon for forces beyond comprehension. I often wonder if my escape was merely a temporary reprieve, and if the darkness I encountered still lingers, waiting patiently for its next opportunity. With every stroke of the keyboard, I acknowledge that the horror is both real and ineffable, existing somewhere between the known and the unknown. Should you, dear reader, feel a chill as you read these words, know that you are not alone in your dread. The inexplicable forces at work in our world are patient and silent, waiting for the moment to make themselves known. I leave you with this lingering uncertainty, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and that the dark corners of our existence may hide more than we dare to imagine. Every word here is a testament to the inexplicable, and though I have tried to outrun the terror, I know now that some horrors are eternal, etched into our very souls. I first noticed something was off on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. I was rushing to leave for work when I discovered my car keys missing from their usual hook by the door. After a frantic search through every drawer and corner of my small apartment, I found them lying on the kitchen counter, precisely where I didn't remember leaving them. I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness and set off for the day. But that little lapse was merely the opening act to a series of increasingly bizarre events that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about my life. In the following days, subtle irregularities began to punctuate my routine. A mug I distinctly recalled placing on the windowsill was later found in the hallway. I'd catch a glimpse of a stranger's face in a shop window, a face that seemed oddly familiar, as if it belonged to someone from my past. But when I tried to recall where I'd seen it before, nothing concrete came to mind. Even my neighbors, once friendly and predictable, started acting strangely. Mrs. Evers, who usually greeted me with a warm good morning, would suddenly fall silent if I mentioned any recent oddities, as though the conversation had evaporated the moment it was uttered. At first, I convinced myself that these were harmless coincidences or the byproducts of stress. Yet as the incidents piled up, the sense of disorientation deepened. One evening, returning from a late shift, I noticed the front door ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it before leaving, but now it dangled slightly open, its lock unfastened. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck as I stepped inside, half expecting someone or something to greet me. The silence inside was oppressive, and even the familiar creaks of the old floorboards sounded alien. The strangest changes, however, were not in the objects around me, but in the people. Friends I'd known for years began recounting recent events as if they'd never happened. When I mentioned a bizarre conversation I'd had with a coworker about a misplaced phone, he blinked, looked confused, and insisted he couldn't remember any such discussion. At a local diner, The waitress who had taken my order smiled in a way that suggested she'd forgotten serving me entirely. These gaps in shared memory grew more frequent, leaving me isolated in experiences that seemed to vanish from everyone else's recollection. My attempts to document the occurrences only deepened my unease. I recorded odd sounds at night, a soft rustling as though someone was pacing just out of sight, whispers that seemed to repeat fragments of conversations I had never started. I scribbled notes in a journal, only to later find entire pages blank, as if the events had been scrubbed from existence. I even tried capturing video footage, but my recordings were plagued by inexplicable glitches, brief moments of static that obscured what should have been clear images of my own living room, or a flicker of a shadow that looked unnervingly like a person standing behind me. As days bled into nights, the boundary between memory and reality began to crumble. One particularly unsettling night, I sat in my living room watching a muted television when the screen suddenly filled with an image of my own front hallway. In it, I saw a figure standing motionless, a person whose features shifted subtly, as if they were never fixed in place. I reached out instinctively, but when I looked again, the image was gone, replaced by the usual static. My heart pounded as I questioned whether I was losing my grip on sanity or if something else was rewriting the rules of my existence. Desperate for answers, I confided in acquaintances and even sought advice from professionals. Yet every conversation ended the same way. My words were met with polite nods and blank stares, as if I were describing something intangible and absurd. One evening, I turned to my closest friend, Mark, and recounted the inexplicable events, the misplaced keys, the shifting objects, the vanishing memories. And he paused, his expression unreadable, before saying, "I don't recall any of that happening." His response sent a chill through me. Was it possible that the events were only mine, fading from everyone else's minds like an erased dream? Now, as I sit here typing these words in the dim light of my apartment, every shadow and creak seems loaded with hidden meaning. I feel increasingly like a spectator in my own life, watching as the world around me is subtly altered, its narrative rewritten while I struggle to cling to my recollections. I have no idea whether these experiences are the product of a fragmented mind or if some unseen force is manipulating reality itself. Every unexplained anomaly, every moment of collective forgetfulness, leaves me with a lingering dread and a profound loneliness. I cannot decide if I am truly losing touch with reality or if I am witnessing something far more sinister, a slow, inexorable erasure of the world I once knew. As the night deepens and the familiar sounds of my apartment shift into something unrecognizable, I'm left with one inescapable question. Am I the only one who remembers? Or is there something out there rewriting our lives, one forgotten moment at a time? I always thought my days followed a predictable script. Wake up, get ready, commute, work, come home, sleep. But one Tuesday morning, as I reached for my usual mug in the kitchen, I noticed it wasn't there. Instead, a different mug rested on the counter, a chipped blue one I'd never seen before. I paused, wondering if I had misplaced my own mug, but the blue one sat there with an eerie certainty. Shrugging it off as an odd moment of forgetfulness, I continued with my routine. On the bus, things started to feel off in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I glanced out the window and swore I saw a man who looked exactly like my co-worker Mark, although I was sure I'd never seen him outside the office. He was dressed in a coat Mark had never worn, and his eyes were vacant, as if he were just a placeholder. I told myself it was a trick of the early morning light or my tired mind playing games. Still, a nagging doubt crept into my thoughts. Arriving at work, I found the lobby subtly altered. The familiar reception desk had shifted from the far end to the center of the room, and the flower arrangement on the table was gone, replaced by a single withered rose. I asked the receptionist if anything had changed, but she smiled politely and said, "No, everything's just the same." I forced a laugh and hurried to my desk, feeling like I'd stepped into a slightly different version of reality. Throughout the day, small glitches continued to manifest. At lunch, I overheard a conversation in the break room that I had no memory of having. A colleague mentioned a meeting that I was sure had been canceled, and when I tried to recall the details, the memory dissolved into a vague impression of routine chatter. I began jotting down these odd occurrences in a notebook, determined to make sense of them, but even the entries seemed to change when I reread them later. Dates shifted, details altered, as if someone had edited my recollections. As the days passed, the glitches became less startling and more a part of my everyday life. I started to notice recurring faces in places I frequented. At the coffee shop on the corner, the barista greeted me by name even though I'd never been a regular. On my evening walk, I encountered a stranger who looked strikingly like my neighbor, Mrs. Patel, though I was positive I'd never seen her outside her own apartment. And then there were the rooms. I entered my apartment one evening after work, and everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for the arrangement of my books on the shelf. A book I always kept on the far left was now in the middle, and a framed photo had rotated 45 degrees on the wall. The changes were minor, almost imperceptible, but they disturbed me deeply. I began to question whether these were random coincidences or signs of something more significant. I tried to rationalize that I was simply tired or stressed, that my mind was tricking me. Yet the evidence piled up. One night, while scrolling through my phone, I noticed a video I didn't remember recording. It was of my living room, taken from an angle I'd never set up, showing a faint, static-like shimmer in the corner, like a ripple in the fabric of space. I rewound the video over and over, searching for an explanation, but the anomaly remained stubbornly out of place. My attempts to share these experiences with friends only deepened my isolation. They listened politely, but insisted that everything was normal. Maybe you're just overthinking it, they said. It's probably just a glitch in your memory. But how could I explain that every day, subtle changes made me feel as though I were slipping into an alternate version of my own life? I began to lose track of what was real. I'd walk into a room expecting one arrangement, only to find that objects had shifted ever so slightly, like a scene being reset and rearranged before my eyes. The repetition became almost comforting in its familiarity, yet horrifying in its implications. I started noticing patterns. A stray newspaper always appearing on the same doorstep, a peculiar sound of a door clicking shut in an empty hallway. Even the color of the sky on my evening walk would sometimes be a shade too vivid. I recorded everything, trying to piece together a coherent picture. The more I looked, the more the world around me seemed to be editing itself. A continuous loop of minor changes that left me questioning whether I was truly experiencing life or merely watching an endless series of glitches. One cold evening, as I sat in my living room trying to make sense of a stack of contradictory notes, I received a notification from my smart home system. Door unlocked. I was certain I had locked every door. I went to check, heart pounding, and found that the front door was indeed ajar. Stepping outside, I saw no one, only the silent street bathed in pale streetlight. But when I looked back inside, the hallway looked different, colors, textures, even the layout of furniture had subtly shifted as if reality itself had been rearranged. In that moment, the feeling of being caught in a loop, in a broken simulation, became undeniable. I realized that these glitches were not just minor errors. They were indications that my reality was fundamentally unstable. The world I once knew was fading, replaced by a constantly shifting tableau that no one else seemed to notice. I began to fear that I might never return to the normal life I remembered. Now, as I write this, I feel the weight of that realization pressing down on me. Every familiar face, every object, every routine is tinged with uncertainty. The lines between what is real and what is a glitch have blurred beyond recognition. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the world to rearrange itself at any moment. I've come to accept that I may be trapped in this loop, a never-ending glitch in the matrix of reality. And as I stare into the flickering light of my computer screen, I can't help but wonder, have I become a permanent part of this fractured world, forever doomed to live in a reality that is no longer mine? It started with something small, so small, in fact, that I almost didn't notice. My phone charger, which I always kept plugged into the outlet beside my bed, was gone one morning. I checked the usual places: my nightstand, the floor, my backpack. Nothing. Annoyed, I grabbed a spare one from my drawer and went about my day, chalking it up to misplacing it in my half-asleep state. The next day, it was my hairbrush, then a coffee mug, then a pair of socks I had left folded on my dresser the night before. Small things, easily lost, easily forgotten. But I wasn't losing them. I was sure of it. It wasn't until the third time I found my house keys in the freezer that I started to feel like something was wrong. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was stressed, distracted. Maybe I was absent-mindedly placing things in the wrong spots without realizing it. But then I started finding things I didn't own. A single red marble on my kitchen counter. A half-burned matchstick in the bathroom sink. A crumpled receipt from a grocery store I had never been to, sitting neatly on my bedside table. I tried brushing it off, convincing myself that I had somehow picked them up without noticing. But the feeling of unease settled deep into my bones. Someone else had been in my apartment. I changed my locks, installed a security camera, and waited. For a while, nothing happened. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that there had been no intruder, that everything had a reasonable explanation. But then, one night, I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. to a faint scraping sound outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body frozen. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging something sharp against the wood. I reached for my phone with shaking fingers and checked the security app. No movement. My screen showed the same still image of my darkened living room, the front door locked, the windows shut. But the noise continued, and I swear I could hear the faintest sound of breathing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, until the sound eventually faded. When I finally gathered the courage to check, there was nothing there. But the next morning, I found something new, a single, deep scratch along the bedroom doorframe, as if something had been dragged across it. I told a friend about it over coffee the next day, expecting them to laugh or offer a logical explanation. Instead, she frowned. "Maybe you're sleepwalking," she suggested. "Or maybe it's just the building settling. Old makes weird noises, you know?" I nodded, pretending that answer satisfied me. But it didn't. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. My belongings continued to disappear and reappear in strange places. Lights would flicker at odd times, always when I was alone. The security footage on my phone would occasionally glitch, skipping ahead minutes at a time. Then came the dreams. They were always the same. I was standing in my living room, staring at my reflection in the dark window. Except it wasn't my reflection. It was off. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Its fingers twitched, long and stiff, pressing against the glass as if trying to get through. And then, just before I woke up, it would tilt its head and smile. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I always locked it before bed. Always. My heart slammed against my ribs as I scanned the dark hallway beyond. Nothing. But when I turned on the lights, I saw them. Footprints. Faint, dusty imprints leading from my doorway to my bed, stopping inches from where I had been sleeping. I left the apartment that morning and didn't go back. I stayed at a friend's place for a few nights, trying to convince myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But when I returned home, something had changed. The air felt heavier, like the silence was pressing against me. My apartment looked the same, but I knew, instinctively, that it wasn't. The final straw came the next night. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of being watched, when my phone vibrated. A notification from my security camera. Motion detected. Living room. My throat tightened. I clicked on the live feed, half expecting to see nothing. But there was something standing just outside my bedroom door. It was dark, its shape indistinct, like a shadow that had peeled itself from the wall. It wasn't moving, just standing there facing my door. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath caught in my throat. Then, as I watched, the figure slowly, so slowly, turn its head toward the camera. And it smiled. The feed cut to static. I was out of that apartment before sunrise, abandoning nearly everything I owned. I didn't care. I packed a single bag, drove until I couldn't anymore, and checked into a hotel miles away. I haven't gone back. A few weeks later, I got a text from an unknown number. No words, no name, just a single image. It was my apartment, my empty bedroom, and on the bed, perfectly centered, was my old coffee mug. The white one, the one I lost. I first noticed something was off on a damp autumn evening while I waited for the late bus near my apartment complex. The streetlights flickered as if struggling against an encroaching darkness, and the distant sound of rain tapping on worn pavement set an uneasy rhythm. I'd been coming home from an extra shift at work, exhausted and eager to get home, when I saw him, a lone stranger standing by the bus stop, partially hidden by the murk of a shadowy alcove. He wasn't dressed in the usual threadbare clothes of someone homeless. Instead, his dark, neat jacket and clean shoes set him apart. His eyes, though, were the part that unsettled me, deep and unblinking, as if he was searching for something in me. I tried to shrug off the chill that raced down my spine, blaming it on the cold night air, and boarded the bus without a word. The ride was strangely silent. I sat in the back, my gaze fixed on the window as the city blurred by in an indifferent procession of neon lights and rainy reflections. But no matter how many times I glanced around, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When the bus pulled up at my stop, I hurried off into the dimly lit street, only to notice that the stranger was nowhere in sight. I assumed I'd simply missed him, but that thought was short-lived. As I made my way to my building, a crumbling structure on the edge of a forgotten block, I caught sight of a figure standing across the street, under the sickly glow of a street lamp. The man's gaze seemed to pierce the darkness, and I could have sworn he was watching my every move. My heart pounded, and I quickened my pace, a growing sense of urgency pushing me onward. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door with trembling fingers and tried to convince myself that it had all been a coincidence, a trick of the night and my exhausted mind. But the unease clung to me like a second skin. The next day, while out running errands in the busy downtown area, I encountered another unsettling detail. I stopped at a small coffee shop for a much-needed break and noticed a man sitting alone at a table in the corner. He wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his face hidden in shadow, yet when our eyes met briefly, I felt a shiver of recognition. I couldn't place his face, but there was an inexplicable familiarity in the way he regarded me, as if he knew more than he should. When I tried to recall the moment later, the details blurred, and the memory of his cold, calculating stare lingered long after I left. Over the following week, strange coincidences began to pile up. I'd lose my keys, only to find them later in unusual places, as if someone were deliberately moving them. At work, colleagues would mention moments from the previous day that I was certain I remembered differently, leaving me questioning whether I was simply misremembering or if my reality was subtly shifting. Even my neighbor, Mr. Delgado, who always greeted me with a friendly nod, suddenly became distant, his eyes briefly betraying an odd mix of pity and warning whenever we passed on the street. I started to receive cryptic text messages on my phone, short, unnerving lines like, "I see you," or "Don't forget who's watching," which I dismissed as pranks until they began arriving with disturbing regularity. Then one night, as I returned from a late dinner at a friend's house, I found my apartment door slightly ajar despite my careful locking rituals. The house was in disarray. Cushions were strewn about, and personal items had been moved, as though someone had been there while I was away. In the pale light of the hallway, I caught a glimpse of that same stranger lingering just beyond the doorway. His presence was an accusation, silent and potent. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to secure every lock and window, convinced that I'd narrowly escaped a break-in. The police arrived only to find nothing amiss. A clean, unviolated apartment that looked exactly as I'd left it, except for the subtle misplacement of a few items that even I couldn't explain. Now, every night is a battle between rational thought and the creeping terror that someone or something is stalking me. I no longer feel safe even in the quiet of my home. Every creak in the dark, every unexpected sound, intensifies the belief that I am being watched. I've seen his face again on a rainy evening near the bus stop and in the blurred reflection of a store window. Always watching, always waiting. I've learned that danger can wear a calm, unassuming face, and that sometimes the most unnerving threats hide in plain sight. My experience has left me with a gnawing question. If this stranger can appear so casually, so deliberately, could there be others like him out there? Could he be just one piece of a larger, more sinister puzzle, an ever-present danger lurking at the edges of everyday life? I don't know if I'm being paranoid, or if I'm truly being hunted by someone with a dark purpose. But every time I catch a glimpse of a shadow that doesn't belong or hear a soft knock in the dead of night, I am reminded that this man could be anywhere, and I fear I'm not the only one who has felt his chilling presence. I never believed I'd lose control of myself. At least that's what I told myself until it started happening, slowly, imperceptibly, until I was no longer sure if I was really me. It began with small gaps in time. I'd be working at my desk when suddenly, minutes would vanish. I'd stare at the clock and swear that it had frozen for a second or two before resuming, as if someone had pressed pause on my life. Then there were the lost hours. I'd return home from work exhausted, only to find that I'd missed entire segments of my day. My phone's log showed gaps I couldn't explain, and when I asked my colleagues about our lunch break or an afternoon meeting, they described events that didn't match my recollections. I started to question whether I had done those things at all, or if they were being filled in by something or someone else. At first, I chalked it up to stress, perhaps the result of too many sleepless nights. But soon it wasn't just time that was slipping away. I began noticing changes in my own behavior. I would catch myself laughing at jokes I didn't remember hearing, or feeling an inexplicable surge of anger for no reason at all. The worst part was the growing realization that the people around me were changing too. Friends would recount conversations with me that I knew I hadn't had. One evening, my best friend, Daniel, told me he'd seen me acting strangely at a party, a version of me that was aggressive, almost hostile, and he described details of my actions that I couldn't recall. I tried to explain that I was tired, that I wasn't myself, but he only looked at me with pity, as if I were a stranger. As the days passed, the sense of being manipulated from within became overwhelming. I started keeping a journal, desperately writing down every moment I could remember, every gap that felt like a missing piece of my identity. I wrote down the odd, fleeting images of my face in mirrors that seemed not quite right, a flicker of someone else's expression, a slight delay in my own reactions. One night, I recorded myself on my phone while sleeping, hoping to catch any evidence of abnormal behavior. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, I saw myself stirring in bed in ways that weren't mine. A twitch of my head, a slight smirk, as if I were reacting to something I wasn't aware of. I replayed the video over and over, each time feeling a chill that no rational explanation could provide. I began to notice that my actions, my very thoughts, seemed to be edited by an unseen hand. Sometimes I'd start a sentence in the middle of a conversation, only to find that the words had changed by the time I finished speaking. Other times, I'd wake up in a place that I didn't remember going to, a local cafe, a friend's apartment, without any recollection of how I got there. I asked my partner about these strange episodes, and although they listened with growing concern, they couldn't offer any explanation. "Maybe you're just stressed," they'd say, patting my arm gently. But deep down, I knew it wasn't stress alone. It was as if parts of me were being overwritten, replaced with a version I hadn't consciously approved. The final, most terrifying blow came on a rainy night. I was alone in my apartment, trying to piece together a coherent timeline of the day, when I noticed a series of messages on my computer screen. Messages that I didn't type. They were simple statements, phrases like "I control you and your actions are mine." At first, I thought it was a prank or a virus, but no matter how many times I restarted the system, the messages reappeared, each time in a slightly different form. My heart pounded as I realized that this was no ordinary glitch or computer error. It was a message, and it was directed at me. I couldn't tell if these events were simply the product of a fragmented mind or if something far more insidious was at work. Every day, I felt as if I were losing a bit more of myself, like someone was editing my memories, my thoughts, even my behavior. I became increasingly isolated, unable to share my terror with those around me. because when I tried, they dismissed it as stress, as an overactive imagination. But I knew the truth. I wasn't the one in control anymore. Now I sit in the dim light of my apartment, the rain tapping against the window, and I wonder if I'll ever be able to reclaim my life. I've learned to document every moment, every slip of behavior, every gap in time, but each entry only deepens my unease. I fear that there's a force, an unseen presence, that has taken hold of me from within, steering my actions and rewriting my history. I've begun to question whether I'm even real, or if I'm merely a puppet in a play I never agreed to star in. There are no answers, no simple explanations for what I've experienced. All I know is that I wake up every day with a lingering, inescapable sensation that I'm being controlled from the outside, that every choice I make might not be mine at all. And so, as I struggle to hold on to the fragments of the person I once was, I can't shake the dreadful feeling that I've lost my autonomy forever. Whether it's my imagination or something far more sinister, I fear I will never be free from this unseen puppeteer, and that the reality I once trusted has been irrevocably altered, leaving me trapped in a waking nightmare with no escape. It started with the doorknob. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I swear to you, that's when I first noticed something was wrong. My apartment has always had a brass doorknob. I remember because I used to joke that it made the whole place look like a relic from the 70s. But one morning, as I reached for it on my way to work, I hesitated. The doorknob was silver. I stood there, my fingers hovering just inches away. It was such a stupid thing to fixate on, and yet my stomach churned with unease. I tried to convince myself that maybe I just never paid close enough attention, that maybe it had always been silver, and I just imagined the brass. But when I got home that evening, it was brass again. I told myself it was the light playing tricks on me. Maybe I was remembering it wrong. Maybe I'd been too tired that morning. There were a dozen logical explanations, and I tried to pick one that made sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then other things started changing. The picture on my nightstand, one of my parents and me at a lake when I was a kid, had always been in a black frame. But one morning, it was in a wooden one. A different shade, a different texture. I stared at it for minutes, trying to convince myself I just hadn't noticed the change before. But I knew I hadn't switched it. Small things at first. My kitchen towels weren't the same color. My favorite mug had a slightly different handle. My living room rug had a faint pattern that I could have sworn wasn't there before. Then it got worse. People started acting strange. At work, my boss called me into his office and asked me how the Johnson account was going. I had no idea what he was talking about. I never worked on the Johnson account. I told him so, expecting some kind of mix-up, maybe a mistaken assignment. But he gave me this weird look and laughed. "You've been working on it for 3 months. Don't joke like that," he said. 3 months? I wanted to argue, to tell him I'd never touched that account in my life. But the certainty in his voice made my stomach twist. So I nodded and mumbled something about needing to check my notes. I sat at my desk for an hour, scrolling through my emails, my documents, everything. There was nothing about a Johnson account. It didn't exist. Not in my files, not in my memory. But everyone else seemed to believe that it did. I tried to ignore it, but the next day it happened again. A coworker stopped by my desk and mentioned our lunch the previous weekend. "What?" I asked, my throat tightening. "You know, Saturday? That diner on 8th Street? The one with the weird paintings?" I had spent Saturday at home, alone. I hadn't left my apartment all day. I told him he must be confusing me with someone else. But he just laughed. "Dude, you ordered the grilled cheese. You said it was the best one you'd ever had." I felt my pulse hammering in my skull. "I was home all Saturday," I said. His smile faded. "No, you weren't." His voice was flat, matter of fact, like he knew something I didn't. That's when I started losing time. I would be at work, typing an email, and then suddenly it was 2 hours later. I'd wake up in bed, but my shoes would be muddy. I'd find my phone in places I never put it, on top of the fridge, inside my bathroom sink, once even under my mattress. I stopped trusting myself. I started writing things down, what I ate, what I did, who I talked to. I'd go to bed clutching my notebook, convinced that I'd wake up and something else would be wrong. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It wasn't coming from inside my apartment. It was outside my window. I live on the 5th floor. I didn't move. I just lay there listening, heart pounding. The whispering was faint, almost melodic, but I couldn't make out the words. I forced myself to turn my head to look. Nothing. But the whispering continued. I barely slept after that. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next change, the next shift in reality that would make me question everything again. I tried talking to people about it. My best friend, Greg, was the first person I told. He frowned, listening patiently as I explained the doorknob, the frame, the missing time. When I finished, he just shook his head. "I think you need to take a break," he said. I wanted to scream. "You don't get it. Things are changing. Things that shouldn't be changing." Greg sighed. "I think you're just stressed. You need sleep, man." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But when I got home that night, my couch was facing the wrong way. I hadn't moved it. No one else had a key. I barely breathed as I looked around my apartment. What else had changed? I went to my bedroom and stopped in the doorway. The bed. The sheets were the wrong color. I hadn't changed them. I stood there paralyzed, feeling the air press against my skin, feeling that horrible, growing certainty that whatever was happening, it was getting worse. That night, I locked my bedroom door. At 3:27 a.m., I woke up standing in my living room. I didn't know how I got there. I didn't know how long I had been there. My front door was unlocked. I checked my phone, my notes, my cameras. Nothing recorded. Nothing missing. Nothing at all to prove that I hadn't just gotten up for a drink of water. Except for one thing. The picture on my nightstand, the one of me and my parents at the lake, it wasn't me in the photo anymore. It was someone who looked like me. But it wasn't me. I stared at it, my breath shallow. The man in the photo had my face, but his eyes were different, too dark, too hollow, too knowing. He was smiling at me. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. Every day things shift. Every day the people around me seem less like themselves and more like something else. No one believes me. No one notices. But I know. I'm not in the same world I started in. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but I don't think I belong here anymore. And worst of all, I don't think I'm the only one who knows. I moved into the old apartment on the edge of a forgotten town with nothing but a few belongings and a desire to start anew. The building, a dilapidated relic with peeling paint and warped windows, exuded a quiet sorrow that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. At first, I attributed the eerie atmosphere to the natural decay of time, but soon, inexplicable events shattered my illusions. It began subtly, a sudden chill in the dead of night, an almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to echo through empty halls. I dismissed these occurrences as tricks of my imagination, fueled by loneliness and the building's grim history. But then came the footsteps. One evening, as I sat alone in the dim glow of a single lamp, I distinctly heard the sound of slow, deliberate steps approaching my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, every nerve alert to the possibility of an intruder. When the sound receded into silence, I hesitated before opening the door, only to find an empty corridor bathed in unsettling darkness. Over the next few nights, the disturbances intensified. I began finding objects moved from their usual places. A book misplaced on a table, a photograph turned face down on the floor. One morning, I discovered an old portrait of a sorrowful woman in my living room, her eyes seeming to plead for recognition. I never saw her before, yet there was an uncanny familiarity in her gaze, as if she were silently recounting a long-forgotten tale of loss. Desperate for answers, I delved into the building's history and uncovered disturbing legends. The previous owner, a reclusive man known for his dabbling in occult rituals, had vanished without a trace decades ago. Whispers in the local community spoke of a cursed presence, his estranged wife, whose untimely disappearance had left a lingering curse that ensnared all who dared enter. The more I learned, the more the eerie occurrences in my apartment took on a sinister clarity, as if I were living within a spectral reenactment of old tragedies. Determined to capture evidence of the inexplicable, I set up a camera in my room. Reviewing the footage sent shivers down my spine. In the dim light of early morning, Fleeting shadows danced just beyond the frame, and at one point, the screen flashed with cryptic symbols that pulsed with a menacing glow. I recalled the historian's warnings about meddling with forces beyond our understanding, but by then, fear had woven itself into every moment of my life. A particularly violent storm one night brought the most terrifying encounter. Amid the roar of thunder and the lashing rain, I awoke to a soft, persistent tapping at my window. Bleary-eyed, I pulled aside the curtain to find a gaunt, pale face pressed against the glass, its eyes wide with despair. In an instant, the visage melted away into the darkness, leaving behind a profound sense of grief and a warning I could not decipher. As days bled into nights, the presence in the apartment grew ever more invasive. I began to hear faint cries echoing through the halls, reminiscent of a lullaby sung in sorrow. The sound of a child's laughter, fragile and haunting, would drift by, only to vanish when I turned on the light. Every shadow and every whisper reminded me that I was not alone. Something ancient and restless had taken residence within these walls. My attempts to flee the apartment were thwarted by an inexplicable force, as if the building itself conspired to trap me in its web of despair. Even after I left, the memories persist. In a new home, I still feel that cold, watching presence in the dead of night, and on stormy evenings, I hear the distant echo of footsteps and soft weeping that refuses to fade. The curse, I fear, is not confined to that forsaken apartment. It has followed me, embedding itself in the very fabric of my existence. Now, I document my experiences with a trembling hand, aware that every word etched in my journal is a testament to a mystery that defies resolution. I have scoured ancient texts and consulted experts in the occult, only to find that the symbols and warnings bear no clear explanation. Instead, they deepen the enigma, hinting at a vast, unknowable darkness that lurks just beyond our perception. I write this account not to seek pity or validation, but to warn those who dare to disturb forces that have slumbered for centuries. Some secrets, once awakened, refuse to remain dormant. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the world outside falls silent, I can almost hear her, an anguished whisper that beckons me back to that place of sorrow and dread. And so, I live in perpetual vigilance, haunted by the unresolved, the inexplicable, and the eternal question: will the darkness ever truly release its grip, or am I destined to be ensnared by its relentless, unyielding presence for the rest of my days? I have since tried to escape, packing my bags in a frenzy one bleak morning. Yet the memory of that haunted apartment clings to me like a second skin. Even miles away, in a new, supposedly safe dwelling, I am tormented by inexplicable occurrences. A mirror that fogs with strange messages, footsteps echoing in empty halls, and that same pervasive feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I catch a fleeting glimpse of a shadow at the edge of my vision, only to have it dissolve into nothingness. The inexplicable connections between my past and present seem to hint that the supernatural forces I disturbed were not confined to that cursed apartment. It is as if they have followed me, tethered by a malevolent force that defies all logic. I now understand that my life is irrevocably intertwined with something ancient and unspeakable, a relentless presence that resides in the spaces between reality and nightmare, waiting patiently for the moment to reclaim its due. And so, every creak, every whisper, and every cold draft is a reminder of that dark chapter, a constant echo of a mystery that remains forever unresolved. There are nights when sleep eludes me entirely, and I lie awake, my mind churning over every unexplained detail, every cryptic symbol etched into my memory. I have taken to recording these episodes, filling pages of a journal with frantic notes and sketches in an attempt to map the inescapable presence that haunts me. Sometimes, the ink bleeds into cryptic patterns, as though the spirit itself guides my hand, forcing secrets onto the paper. I have tried to decipher these markings, consulting old texts and obscure legends, but the more I learn, the deeper I sink into an abyss of uncertainty. It feels as if I am piecing together a puzzle with missing fragments, a narrative of despair and forgotten sins that will never be complete. And in the quiet, suffocating moments, I wonder if the true horror is not the specters that cross my path, but the relentless, consuming void of unanswered questions that now defines my existence. I have spent countless nights awake, haunted by the relentless echo of that sorrowful whisper and the inescapable feeling of being watched. The days have grown long with the burden of knowing that the veil between the living and the dead is perilously thin. I now measure time not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the moments of terror that punctuate my existence. In every creak of the floor and every rustle of the wind, I perceive an unseen presence, a silent observer whose motives remain as enigmatic as the cryptic symbols carved into the walls. It is a presence that defies explanation, a specter woven from the fabric of lost souls and unspoken regrets, and it has left an indelible mark on my very being. My heart aches with the knowledge that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved, and that the darkness I have encountered may one day reclaim the light that I so desperately cling to. This account is my final testament to the bizarre and haunting events that have reshaped my life. Though I have tried to escape the suffocating grip of that supernatural force, I am left with only memories that refuse to fade, and a persistent sense of foreboding that accompanies me wherever I go. The ghosts of the past, it seems, are ever present, bound by a curse that transcends the boundaries of time and space. I implore you, dear reader, to heed my words and be cautious when confronting the unknown, for the specters that lurk in the dark are not always content to remain hidden. They are patient, enduring, and capable of seeping into the very essence of your soul, leaving you with a lingering question. When the shadows stir, who among us can say with certainty that we are truly alone? Even now, as I recount these harrowing events, an oppressive dread lingers at the back of my mind. The line between reality and nightmare has blurred, and I cannot escape the feeling that I am merely a pawn in a game orchestrated by forces far beyond my control. I have learned that the echoes of the past resonate through the corridors of time, leaving indelible marks on those who dare to listen. Each unexplained occurrence is a reminder that some histories are not meant to be unearthed, and that the shadows of forgotten tragedies can reach out to claim what remains. I offer this chronicle as both a confession and a cautionary tale, a plea for others to heed the silent warnings embedded in the dark corners of their own lives. Should you ever feel the prickling of unseen eyes, or hear the soft murmur of voices in the void, know that you are not alone, and that sometimes the most terrifying specters are those that reside within the recesses of your own memory. It began on an ordinary morning when I walked into the small cafe on the corner of 5th and Main, the one I'd frequented for years. I had my usual order, a black coffee and a blueberry muffin, and settled into my favorite seat by the window. That's when I noticed him, a man with striking features, dressed in a gray suit that somehow looked out of place in our neighborhood. He sat at a table across from me, reading a newspaper with headlines that I couldn't quite make out from my seat. There was something almost familiar about his presence, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I sipped my coffee and tried to dismiss the uneasy feeling that crept in, chalking it up to a momentary lapse in my morning routine. The next day at work, I met a new colleague in our department, a quiet, reserved man named Alan who had just joined our team. During a brief conversation in the break room, I noticed that Alan bore an uncanny resemblance to the stranger from the cafe. His eyes, a deep and unyielding blue, were the same, and he moved with an air of deliberate calm. At first, I assumed it was a mere coincidence, but as the day wore on, I began to question my memory. I distinctly remembered the cafe stranger, yet now here was Alan, as if he had stepped out of that morning scene and into my workplace. Over the following week, oddities began to manifest in ways I couldn't ignore. I started to lose hours, moments of time that seemed to vanish without explanation. One evening, I left my apartment with a clear plan for dinner, only to return 2 hours later, confused as to how much time had passed. My phone's timestamp contradicted my recollection, and even my own watch seemed to lag behind, as though time itself were slipping through my fingers. At work, I would glance at the clock and swear I'd seen it freeze for a second, the hands pausing in mid-motion before resuming as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just time. My surroundings began to feel subtly off. In the hallway of my apartment building, I would encounter the same person, a man with the same intense blue eyes, but his appearance would change each time. One day, he wore a dark overcoat and a flat cap. The next, a light jacket and a fedora. His expression, though always calm, varied from impassive to almost eerily cheerful, as if he were aware of something I wasn't. I tried to mention these changes to friends and coworkers, but they brushed it off as my imagination running wild, insisting that I was mistaken about having seen the same face repeatedly. Then, one afternoon, I returned to my apartment after a long day and found the room arranged differently. I was certain I'd left my belongings exactly as they were. Yet now my books were stacked neatly on a shelf instead of scattered on the coffee table, and a framed photo of my family had been rotated slightly off its usual spot. I couldn't recall moving anything, and when I asked my roommate about it, he simply shrugged and said he hadn't touched a thing. But I knew what I'd seen. Later that evening, while scrolling through old photographs on my phone, I noticed an unsettling detail. In several images, a figure loomed in the background, a blurred silhouette that resembled the man from the cafe and my coworker Alan. Yet its presence was inconsistent, sometimes visible, sometimes not, as if it were phasing in and out of existence. Each incident left me with a growing sense of disorientation. I began documenting everything, writing down times and details in a journal, trying desperately to find a pattern or logical explanation. But the more I recorded, the more the anomalies piled up. It wasn't just the environment that was shifting. My own memories seemed to betray me. I remembered certain conversations and events clearly, only to later find that those same events played out differently in the recollections of others. A coworker would recount a meeting with details that contradicted my own notes. A friend mentioned a dinner I was sure I hadn't attended. My mind was becoming a maze of conflicting timelines and altered recollections. The repeated encounters with that elusive man, whose face was both constant and ever-changing, began to erode the boundary between what was real and what was not. I would see him in reflections, on the glass door of a subway car, in the polished surface of a restaurant table, always watching, always shifting subtly in appearance. The feeling of déjà vu became overwhelming, as if I were trapped in a loop where every moment was a replay of a scene with slight, disturbing variations. One chilly evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, I experienced a final, undeniable glitch. I was watching a documentary on my laptop when I looked up, and for a split second, my surroundings froze. The sound of the ticking clock in the corner stopped, the hum of the refrigerator faded into silence, and even the soft murmur of the TV became muted. I blinked, and everything snapped back into place as though a hidden mechanism had reset the scene. In that moment of frozen time, I felt a cold realization wash over me. The world I had known, my memories, my routines, my relationships, might be nothing more than an elaborate illusion, a construct marred by glitches that I was now becoming an integral part of. I haven't been able to shake the feeling since. Every day, I wake up wondering if I'll experience another shift, a sudden loss of time, a misplaced object, a face that shouldn't be there. The boundaries between past and present, reality and illusion, are fraying, and I'm caught in the midst of it. I keep searching for answers, for some logical thread to pull that might unravel this anomaly. But the more I look, the deeper the mystery becomes. I fear that I've become entangled in a glitch that will never allow me to return to the reality I once knew. Now, as I write these words, I feel that every moment is unstable, that my life is part of a vast, inexplicable loop, a simulation where every detail can be rewritten at any moment. And in that final, disquieting thought, I'm left to wonder if I will ever find my way back, or if I am doomed to exist forever within this shifting, surreal mosaic of altered time and fragmented memory. I moved to the city last summer for a fresh start and a new job, eager to embrace the unfamiliar. In those early days, everything felt open and promising. One bright morning at a local art gallery where I volunteered, I met Daniel, a friendly man with an easy smile and an engaging manner. He chatted about the quirky architecture, the best hidden cafes, and even the local art scene. His warmth and charm made him seem like just another kind soul in a big, bustling city, and I found his company pleasantly surprising. Over the following days, I began to notice Daniel in increasingly unexpected places. At first, it was simple coincidences, a glimpse at the bus stop, a brief encounter near my favorite coffee shop, or a nod in passing on my morning jog. I dismissed these as harmless overlaps in our routines. But soon, the details grew too specific to ignore. One crisp afternoon while I was waiting for the bus, Daniel approached me with a casual greeting and mentioned that he'd seen me earlier that day at the new bookstore on Elm Street. I was startled. I hadn't mentioned that outing to anyone, yet he described it in minute detail, even noting the book I had been eyeing. The unsettling pattern continued. At work, during a quiet lunch break in the park, I overheard two strangers discussing someone who frequented the same obscure corners of the city as I did. They mentioned details about my daily route, my favorite park bench, and even the time I usually grab my morning coffee. I felt an icy dread. Had my personal habits become public knowledge? The once friendly interactions with Daniel now left me questioning how much he truly knew. His conversations grew increasingly intrusive. One day, as we talked near a busy intersection, he casually remarked, "You must be tired from all that walking to your secret hideaway at the library yesterday." I froze. How could he know I had spent hours in quiet solitude among the stacks when I'd never shared that detail with him? Then came the day that shattered any lingering hope it was all coincidence. Returning home late one rainy evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single note in spidery handwriting. "I know your secrets." My heart hammered as I scanned the room, half expecting to see Daniel lurking in the shadows. When I peered through the peephole, I saw nothing but the rain-soaked corridor. Yet the oppressive feeling of being watched clung to me. I began noticing more inexplicable details. Small objects in my apartment rearranged, items I distinctly remembered leaving in one place now inexplicably elsewhere. It felt as if someone was piecing together my private life, minute by minute. Sleep eluded me. Each night, I lay awake in darkness, haunted by the possibility that I was being monitored. I began to alter my routine, taking different routes to work, avoiding my usual haunts, even leaving earlier to dodge any potential encounters. Despite these precautions, every time I stepped outside, I caught fleeting glimpses of Daniel, a silhouette in a shop window, a reflection in a passing car, or that same unnerving smile from across the street. His presence was constant, almost ritualistic, and with every encounter, the friendly facade crumbled a little more. In desperate need of answers, I tried piecing together any information I could find about him. I asked neighbors and co-workers, but whenever I mentioned his name, the responses were vague, as if he were a ghost in their collective memory. One longtime resident, Mrs. Larson, confided that Daniel had been in the neighborhood for as long as anyone could remember, yet no one recalled when or how he had first appeared. It was as though he had always been there, an unremarkable part of the background until now. The final, unnerving incident occurred on a quiet, moonlit night. I had decided to take a solitary walk to clear my mind, hoping that the cool air would dispel the creeping anxiety. As I meandered through a deserted side street, I saw him again. Daniel was standing under a flickering street lamp, his eyes glinting in the dim light, as if he were silently cataloging every move I made. He didn't speak. He simply stared, and in that frozen moment, the friendly stranger I once thought I'd met transformed into something far more sinister. My heart pounded so loudly, I feared he might hear it. I turned and fled, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty street as I questioned everything I had ever believed. Even now, as I write these words, my mind is a tumult of rational inquiry and primal fear. I scour every detail of my day for clues, a misplaced item, a whispered remark overheard in passing, a strange compliment that references a private moment. I have considered the possibility that my imagination is betraying me, that perhaps my mind is weaving elaborate connections where none exist. But the precise way Daniel seems to know intimate details of my life, the eerie timing of his appearances when I'm most vulnerable, and the lingering note that declared, "I know your secrets," suggests something far more deliberate. I've tried to find a logical explanation, perhaps an overzealous admirer, a harmless coincidence, or even a clever prank. Yet every theory falls apart under scrutiny. The frequency and accuracy of these encounters, the unnerving consistency of his knowledge, and the relentless feeling that I am being drawn into an obsessive plan leave me with more questions than answers. As I sit here in the dim light of my study, every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind against the window stokes the fear that I am not alone, that my life has become the subject of someone's dark, meticulous scrutiny. Was it all mere coincidence, or is someone tracking me, blending kindness with a creeping sense of control? I can't shake the feeling that Daniel is not just a friendly face in the crowd, but a deliberate presence in my life, one that may have been lurking in the background far longer than I ever imagined. And so, with every step I take, every glance over my shoulder, I am left to wonder, is my world truly as ordinary as it seems, or have I unwittingly stepped into the shadow of something far more sinister? At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I moved into a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of a bustling city, believing it would be a fresh start away from the chaos of my previous life. The building was old, its paint peeling and floors creaking with every step, but it had a comforting familiarity that reminded me of simpler times. My landlord, an affable man named Mr. Garner, welcomed me with a warm smile and a set of keys, assuring me that the apartment had been unoccupied for a while and that there was nothing unusual about it. I accepted his explanation and began to settle in, arranging my few belongings in the modest space. The first week passed without incident, marked by mundane routines and the occasional creak of the building. But then small, subtle anomalies began to surface, things I could easily dismiss as coincidences or the result of my own fatigue. I noticed that a framed photograph on the mantel, which I distinctly remembered placing there, was missing one morning, only to reappear the next day on a shelf I didn't recall using. At first, I assumed I must have moved it in a daze, but deep down, a faint chill told me otherwise. Then there was the sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to murmur from empty corners, a murmur that would stop abruptly when I turned to locate its source. I rationalized it as the wind sneaking through a gap or the old pipes settling. Yet the unease began to gnaw at me. Over time, the incidents grew more perplexing. I encountered individuals in the narrow hallways who, despite their casual nods and half-smiles, struck me as inexplicably familiar. Their eyes carried a sadness and a knowing look that made me question if I'd seen them before in dreams or old photographs. One evening, while returning from a late shift at the diner, I passed a woman in a long, dark coat who paused to look directly at me. Her gaze was piercing, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as though she was silently communicating a warning. When I blinked, she was gone, leaving only an echo of her presence lingering in the corridor. I tried to discuss these encounters with friends, but they dismissed them as mere figments of an overworked mind, incapable of conjuring such specific details. The anomalies escalated gradually, their cumulative effect pushing me into a state of constant vigilance. Objects that I was sure I had placed in one location would inexplicably vanish, only to reappear in odd places, sometimes behind closed doors, sometimes atop shelves I never touched. The persistent sound of footsteps in the dead of night, the muffled conversations that seemed to emanate from rooms long abandoned, and the recurring vision of a shadowy figure reflected in a window all chipped away at my confidence in my own sanity. I began recording these moments on my phone, hoping to capture tangible evidence of the inexplicable. However, playback only revealed static, fragmented sounds and blurry images that left more questions than answers. Desperation set in as I sought logical explanations for what I was experiencing. I scoured local archives, searching for any history of strange occurrences in the building, and even consulted a friend who dabbled in folklore. All I found were vague references to past tenants who claimed similar disturbances, a series of coincidences that were quickly brushed aside by rational minds. Yet, every recorded anomaly, every fleeting moment of uncanny familiarity, eroded the boundary between reality and the shadows of my imagination. I was left wondering if I was merely the victim of an overactive mind, or if something else was orchestrating these events from behind the veil of normalcy. Now, as I write this in the quiet hours of the night, I can no longer tell if I am witnessing a genuine unraveling of reality or if I have succumbed to an intricate illusion spun by my own weary consciousness. The apartment seems to hum with secrets, its walls whispering of things that should not be, and every unexplained movement makes my heart race with a mix of dread and curiosity. I have compiled what little evidence I could gather, yet no one is willing to believe that an ordinary building could harbor such a subtle, persistent force. The questions remain unanswered. Are these disturbances real manifestations of a hidden presence, or are they the scattered remnants of a mind on the brink of collapse? I am left in limbo, uncertain whether to continue seeking a logical explanation or to surrender to the possibility that reality itself might be far more fragile than I ever imagined. Last night, as I sat alone with the soft hum of the city outside and the persistent creaks of my aging home, I experienced the most unnerving moment yet. I had been reviewing my recordings when I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible background melody, a lullaby, perhaps, that was not there before. The notes were tender yet haunting, stirring memories I couldn't place. I followed the sound to the kitchen, where the light from the overhead bulb flickered in a rhythmic pattern, almost as if synchronizing with the melody. The source of the music was nowhere to be seen, yet the sensation of being observed was overwhelming. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone, that something intangible was guiding these disturbances, orchestrating them with a purpose I could not comprehend. With each passing moment, the line between my internal fears and the reality around me blurred, leaving me trapped in a limbo of uncertainty. The realization that my own perceptions might be betraying me was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it suggested that my mind might be unraveling, and liberating because it allowed the possibility that the inexplicable was real after all. As I write, the silence of my apartment feels heavy with unspoken secrets, and I wonder if I will ever find solace or if I am destined to wander these haunted corridors of my existence forever. Every day now feels like a battle between reason and the unknown. I keep questioning the reality of these events, if they are true or merely a reflection of my deepest anxieties. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of movement in the periphery of my vision. Other times, I hear a voice calling my name from empty rooms. I have tried to confide in neighbors and friends, but their lack of concern only deepens my isolation. The more I search for a rational explanation, the more elusive it becomes. I find myself wondering if I am being drawn into a narrative not of my own making, a story where the line between truth and hallucination is irrevocably blurred. There is an unsettling possibility that the building holds a secret, one that whispers of past lives, lost moments, and unresolved mysteries. Perhaps these occurrences are remnants of a history that refuses to be forgotten, or maybe they are echoes of something far more sinister, a force that feeds on our perception of reality. I am left with more questions than answers. What is the source of these strange occurrences? Can they be explained by logic, or are they a sign of a reality far beyond human comprehension? As I write these words, I remain uncertain, caught between a desire for explanation and the dread that perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. I do not know if tomorrow will bring clarity, or if it will further blur the lines between what is real and what is imagined. In this liminal space, I must continue to search for truth, even as I fear that the truth may be more terrifying than the shadows that now haunt me. I used to believe that my world was solid, unchanging, a tapestry woven from ordinary, reliable moments. But one day, everything began to unravel in the smallest ways imaginable. It started with my favorite mug. Every morning, Without fail, I'd placed that chipped, blue porcelain cup on the small table by my kitchen window. One evening, I returned from work and found it exactly as I'd left it. Later that night, as I sat reading in my living room, I glanced at the table again, and there it was still in the same spot, as if time had paused just for that object. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing more than a comforting consistency in a hectic world. But in the days that followed, similar anomalies began to emerge. On my daily walk to catch the bus, I passed the same bright red car parked along the curb. I noticed it once, then again, and yet again, as if it were following me down the street. I distinctly remembered not seeing it during my previous commute, but there it was every time I looked over my shoulder. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was an ordinary coincidence or a quirk of my memory, but the car's repetitive presence gnawed at me. When I returned home from work one evening, I found small notes placed on my door. They were written in neat handwriting I couldn't recall ever using, each one containing a single, puzzling word. Again, repeat, cycle. I searched my apartment for any sign that someone else had been there, but everything was as I had left it. The lights, the pictures on the walls, even the arrangement of my books on the shelf were unchanged. Yet something about their precise order felt off, as if an unseen force had carefully reset every detail. The more I scrutinized my surroundings, the more I noticed subtle shifts. One day, I discovered that the framed photo on my mantle, the one of me with my closest friends, had rotated exactly 90 degrees from its usual position. I distinctly remembered hanging it upright, but now it leaned sideways, a silent disruption in an otherwise static room. At work, a conversation with a colleague felt eerily repetitive. I recalled discussing a new project with him just last week, only for him to reference that very same meeting with the exact same details, as if we were trapped in a loop of recollection. Yet, to everyone else, nothing seemed amiss. As these glitches multiplied, so did my sense of being drawn into a pattern I couldn't break. I began keeping a journal, chronicling every inexplicable repetition. A misplaced book, a repeated phrase on a billboard, the sudden reappearance of my red car along the same stretch of road. Each entry revealed minute differences, a slight variation in tone, a barely perceptible shift in position, an altered detail that shouldn't have been there if nothing had changed. I started to wonder if these weren't random coincidences at all, but deliberate adjustments in the fabric of my daily life. One chilly evening, after a particularly long day filled with these unsettling repetitions, I sat in my living room and stared at the mug once more. It was exactly where I'd left it in the morning, its blue glaze catching the light just so. And yet, as I observed it, I felt as though I were watching a scene I'd seen before, not quite identical, but too similar to be a coincidence. A growing dread took root in me, a fear that my reality was not as stable as I had once believed. The sense of repetition was no longer a quirky oddity. It was the beating heart of a much larger, inexplicable system in which I was now entangled. I started to feel as though I were not merely an observer in this life, but an active participant in a glitch, a recurring error in the programming of existence. Every step I took seemed predestined, every decision a line of code already written. My memories began to blur with these repetitive moments, and I could no longer tell if they were genuine or fabricated by a system that had long since broken down. I felt like a character in a story being rewritten in real time, with every moment reset and replayed with minor, unnerving deviations. Late one night, I sat at my desk reviewing my journal, the pages filled with dates and details that now seemed almost mechanical in their precision. In a moment of quiet terror, I realized that the very act of writing these entries was part of the pattern, a constant, unchanging refrain in a world that was glitching in and out of coherence. The thought chilled me to the core. What if everything I knew, every cherished memory, and every seemingly random detail of my life was nothing more than a sophisticated illusion? What if reality itself were a program, and I was caught in an endless loop of repeating cycles, unable to break free? Now, as I type these words, I can't help but feel that each keystroke is predetermined, each moment a replay of a sequence I have already lived. The red car, the unmoved mug, the mysteriously rotated photo. All of them serve as constant reminders that the world I once trusted is not as fixed as it appears. I am no longer certain that I am in control of my own destiny. Instead, I feel as though I have become part of a grand, unyielding glitch in the matrix of existence, a fragment of a code that repeats endlessly, with no hope of escape or alteration. In confronting this unsettling possibility, I'm left with more questions than answers. Is my reality fake? Am I simply an unwitting character in a cosmic simulation, doomed to repeat the same moments over and over? And if so, does it even matter whether I break free or remain trapped in this endless cycle? As I stare into the familiar reflection of my life, I can't help but wonder if the illusion of normalcy was ever real at all, or if I have always been part of a glitch, a permanent error in a programmed universe that I can neither control nor escape. I moved into my new apartment complex last fall, a modest building with a mix of aging brick and overgrown ivy that gave it an almost timeless quality. I'd always been wary of the idea of neighbors, but the charm of the place made me overlook that concern until I met Derek. On the day I arrived, he introduced himself with a friendly smile as he lugged a box up the stairs 2 doors down. He was polite, his tone warm and conversational, and for a few weeks, our interactions remained strictly neighborly. He'd ask how my day was going and occasionally compliment my choice of decor, making small talk that felt entirely normal, even pleasant. It wasn't until a few weeks later that subtle cracks began to appear in Derek's pleasant facade. One chilly evening, as I was returning from a late shift at the local diner, I noticed him leaning casually against the railing outside my building's entrance. His gaze lingered a little too long, and his smile, though still friendly, seemed to hide something indefinable behind it. When I asked if everything was all right, he merely said, "I'm just enjoying the night air," but there was a glint in his eyes that made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a random, harmless encounter, but a lingering unease settled in my chest. Over the next several days, Derek's behavior grew incrementally more intrusive. He began asking oddly specific questions about my daily routine, what time I left for work, when I usually returned, even if I locked my door. At first, I assumed it was innocent curiosity, a neighbor's attempt to make conversation. But then he started commenting on details I had never shared, like the route I took on my evening walks. One afternoon, while I was in the lobby picking up a package, I overheard him speaking softly into his phone about making sure everything stays on track. I couldn't be sure if he was referring to me, but the thought sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to rationalize his actions. Perhaps he was simply an overly friendly person with an intense interest in those around him. Yet every time I crossed paths with him in the hallway, his compliments became more pointed, almost as if he was trying to remind me of something I'd forgotten. "You have a unique style," he once said, his eyes locked on mine for an unsettling moment. "It's a pity you don't see how rare that is." At that moment, I felt exposed, as if he were dissecting parts of me no one else could see. I started to question whether his interest was purely benign or if there was an undercurrent of something more controlling in his tone. Late one night, I returned home to find my front door slightly ajar, though I was sure I'd locked it. The dim corridor was silent, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I rushed to lock every window and bolt the door, my heart pounding in my ears. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing small changes around my apartment. Misplaced items, personal belongings that seemed to have been rearranged without my knowledge. A scarf I'd hung on the back of my chair was found folded neatly on the coffee table. A book I distinctly remembered leaving on my shelf was now on the kitchen counter. I couldn't explain it. Either I was losing my mind, or someone was deliberately altering my environment. My growing unease peaked when I received a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten note that simply read, "I know your routine." There was no signature, no indication of when or how it had been delivered. I spent the night pacing my apartment, unable to shake the feeling that every creak of the floorboards and every rustle in the hallway was a sign of Derek's silent presence. I started avoiding the communal areas, opting instead to use the stairs even though the elevator was right there. its doors now feeling like portals into an unknown threat. One morning, determined to confront my growing fear, I casually mentioned my concerns to a mutual acquaintance in the lobby. The person listened politely, but then looked away, as if uncomfortable discussing anything beyond small talk. When I pressed further, they muttered something about everyone having their quirks and that I shouldn't read too much into it. Their evasiveness only deepened my suspicion. Had I imagined the escalation, or was Derek orchestrating something far more sinister than simple neighborly chatter? Then, one rainy evening, as the city lights blurred against the downpour, I caught a glimpse of Derek outside my window. I was curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with an old movie, when I saw him standing beneath a street lamp just across the courtyard. He stared directly at me, his expression unreadable. For a long, agonizing minute, our eyes met through the raindrops. In that moment, I felt a raw, unfiltered surge of terror, a primal warning that my life might be under threat. I couldn't tell if it was the rain, the dark reflections in the glass, or his intense stare, but I knew I had to get out. I haven't seen Derek behave as overtly aggressive, but the pattern was unmistakable. His questions became more invasive, his compliments laced with a predatory tone. I started altering my routine completely, leaving earlier, taking different routes, even avoiding going out at night. Every time I left, I felt the nagging suspicion that he was watching, waiting for the slightest misstep. I've tried to share my experiences with friends and even reported a few incidents to the building manager, but the responses have been dismissive, a mixture of polite reassurance and baffled confusion. Now, as I write this, I'm sitting in a small, temporary apartment far from the complex, the memories of Derek's unsettling presence still echoing in every shadow. I don't know if I'm simply overreacting or if I truly escaped from someone whose intentions were far more controlling than I ever realized. The question remains, was Derek merely a peculiar, overly friendly neighbor with an unsettling streak, or was he a sign of something much darker lurking beneath the surface of everyday life? I still get inexplicable messages now and then, a misplaced compliment in an email, a cryptic note left on my doorstep, that make me wonder if I've really left him behind or if his reach extends further than I ever imagined. And so, I remain alert, haunted by the lingering thought that danger might be just a step away, and that perhaps my experience isn't as isolated as I'd like to believe. I woke up one ordinary Tuesday morning with the same routine I'd followed for years. Alarm blaring at 6:30, a hot shower, and a quick glance at the calendar pinned to my fridge. But as I sipped my coffee and scanned the headlines, I noticed a detail that made me pause. The date in the newspaper's header read Tuesday, the 12th, even though today was clearly the 13th. I shrugged it off as a printing error and went about my day. It wasn't long before other small inconsistencies began to surface. On my drive to work, I passed a familiar storefront that always displayed the same array of posters. Today, one of the posters had been replaced with a new, cryptic image, a pair of eyes staring directly out. I blinked, convinced I was mistaken. Later at the office, I greeted a coworker who looked exactly like me, in the same clothes I'd worn the previous week. He merely smiled and said, "Morning," as if nothing were amiss, and I wondered if I was mixing up memories. Yet, as the day went on, the feeling of déjà vu intensified. The first real glitch happened during my lunch break. I ducked into a small cafe I frequented, only to find the counter arranged in a completely different layout. The barista, a cheerful young woman I'd known for months, seemed puzzled when I asked about the change. "We remodeled overnight," she explained casually, as if a complete overhaul of our usual surroundings were normal. I left the cafe unsettled, my thoughts racing with questions. Had I really seen things differently, or was reality itself shifting around me? As the days passed, these odd occurrences grew in number and detail. I would walk down the same street and encounter the same stranger at the exact same intersection. Dressed in an outfit I remembered him wearing only a few days earlier, yet he nodded as though acknowledging a secret only he knew. At home, everyday objects would be rearranged without explanation. A book I distinctly remembered on the coffee table would be found on the shelf instead, and my keys sometimes disappeared only to reappear in odd places like the fridge or the bathroom. I tried to convince myself that I was simply tired or absent-minded, but the glitches were too consistent, too precise to be mere coincidence. One evening, while watching a movie alone, I glanced at the clock on my wall. The time jumped backward by several minutes, then resumed normally, as if a hidden editor had rewound a scene. I paused the movie and stared at the clock in disbelief. I rewound the film on my remote control, expecting to see the same moment repeated, but nothing happened. I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. I started documenting everything in a small notebook, a habit I'd never had before. I jotted down times, dates, and descriptions of every odd event, convinced that if I could piece together the anomalies, I might find an explanation. Yet, the more I wrote, the less coherent the pattern became. Sometimes, I'd write an entry, only to find the same words scrawled on another page, as though my thoughts had been duplicated. There were moments when I'd open the notebook and find blank pages where I was sure I had recorded a vivid event. The strangest incident occurred one evening as I returned home from a late dinner. I walked into my apartment, and immediately the air felt different, thicker, almost charged with a silent energy. I flicked on the lights and saw that every picture frame in my living room was turned to face the wall, even though I distinctly remembered arranging them facing the room. In the mirror above the mantel, my reflection lagged ever so slightly behind my movements, as if it were buffering, trying to catch up to the real me. I rubbed my eyes and blinked, hoping that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the changes persisted. At first, I was unnerved, questioning whether I was imagining the glitches or if my mind was being tampered with in some inexplicable way. But over time, the disturbances became a part of my daily life. I began to anticipate the slight shifts, the rearranged furniture, the altered posters, the uncanny repetitions of faces in the crowd. I stopped reacting with shock. Instead, I watched, almost clinically, as reality itself seemed to stutter and skip like a scratched record. The sense of repetition grew, blurring the lines between what was real and what was not, until I felt as though I were living in a loop, a version of the world that was subtly, yet irrevocably different. One morning, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing my notebook, I noticed a final entry I hadn't written. In neat, unfamiliar handwriting, it read, "There is no going back. You are part of the glitch now." My heart pounded as I scanned the page, trying to remember if I had ever scribbled those words. I hadn't. I looked around my apartment. Everything appeared normal. The misplaced mug was back on the table. The doorknob shimmered in its usual brass hue, but I knew something was fundamentally altered. It wasn't just that my surroundings were changing. It was me. The repeated inconsistencies weren't random anomalies. They were signals, a persistent echo that I, too, was part of this ever-shifting tapestry. I began to wonder if the world I had known had fractured into something unrecognizable, if every moment was a glitch in a vast, crumbling simulation. The feeling settled deep in my bones that I might never return to a normal reality, that I had been absorbed into this glitch, unable to step outside the cycle of repetitive distortions. I stopped trying to fix things or to understand the underlying pattern. Instead, I accepted the surreal, unsettling cadence of my existence. Each day, I live with the quiet dread that every step, every blink, every heartbeat might be altered by forces beyond my control. Now, as I write these words, I can't help but notice the subtle flicker in the corner of my eye, a reminder that reality itself is unstable. I've become accustomed to the glitches, to the eerie repetition that warps the familiar into something alien. And in a moment of stillness, I realize with chilling clarity, I may have become part of this endless loop, a permanent glitch in the matrix from which there is no escape. I first met him on a rainy afternoon when I was waiting in line at a small bookstore downtown. I just moved to the city and was trying to build a sense of normalcy by exploring local spots. He approached me with a warm smile and a genuine compliment about the book I was holding. His name was Daniel, and at first, he seemed like one of those rare, friendly souls who make you feel at ease with just a few kind words. We chatted briefly about literature and the quirks of city life, and he even offered a recommendation for a local cafe he claimed was an absolute gem. I left the encounter feeling unexpectedly buoyant, as if I'd made a new friend on my first day in a strange place. Over the next few weeks, I began to see Daniel again and again, though always in passing. I'd run into him at the bus stop, at the grocery store, and even near my apartment building. Each time, his smile was there, and his greetings were warm but a little too familiar, as if he knew my schedule better than I did. At first, I shrugged it off as mere coincidence, a chance meeting with a kind stranger who happened to frequent the same parts of town. But then little details began to accumulate. One evening, as I was walking home after a late shift, I noticed him sitting on a bench across the street. I couldn't recall ever taking that route at that hour, and the fact that he was there made my stomach clench. His eyes met mine for a moment before he looked away, leaving me with an uneasy mix of curiosity and dread. It started with small, seemingly trivial details. I began receiving casual text messages from an unknown number that mentioned things like, "Hope you enjoyed that new coffee spot today," or "The weather was perfect for a walk, wasn't it?" I assumed it was some kind of marketing ploy until I recalled Daniel's friendly remark about knowing the best spots in town. Yet I couldn't remember giving him my number. The texts were always polite, even caring, but they hinted at a knowledge of my day that I hadn't willingly shared. One message, sent on a day when I'd taken an unexpected detour on my way home, read, "Sometimes the road less traveled holds the most surprises." It was a phrase he'd used during one of our brief conversations, and it sent chills down my spine. Then came the days when Daniel's presence seemed to seep into every part of my life. I would be at work, lost in thought at my desk, when a coworker would mention seeing someone who looked uncannily like him lingering outside the building. I'd brush it off until I found a single, neatly folded napkin on my desk bearing a scribbled note. "I hope your day is as bright as your smile." The handwriting was similar to the one on the text messages, too precise, too personal. At home, small items would mysteriously shift positions. My keys on the kitchen counter one day, on the coffee table the next, with no logical explanation, as if someone had been subtly rearranging my space. I began to feel the creeping sensation of being watched, of my private moments being observed by someone with an unsettling familiarity. One night, I decided to confront my growing anxiety. I made an appointment with a friend to talk through what I was experiencing, but even then, their concern was tempered by confusion. "Are you sure it wasn't just your imagination?" they asked, urging me to consider the possibility that I was overreacting after a stressful move. But I couldn't shake the memory of Daniel's calm voice, his eyes that seemed to track my every move, and the inexplicable knowledge he had of details I hadn't disclosed. I started to question my own recollections. Had I inadvertently mentioned too much about my routines? Did I leave behind digital breadcrumbs that someone could easily follow? Every answer only deepened the mystery. Things came to a head one chilly evening when I decided to take a detour through a park on my way home. The path was lit by sporadic street lamps, and the mist lent everything an ethereal quality. I suddenly felt a prickle along my neck, a sense of being observed that made me quicken my pace. Turning a corner, I saw Daniel standing beneath a flickering lamp post, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He waved casually as if to say hello, but his presence was so out of place, so disturbingly persistent, that I broke into a run. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my apartment, where I locked every door and window, my heart pounding in my ears. Now, as I sit in the relative darkness of my new apartment, far away from the familiar streets I once roamed, I'm left with a constant, gnawing question. Daniel's face still appears in the back of my mind, his kind smile now laced with an inscrutable, almost predatory interest. I've tried to find a logical explanation. Perhaps it was all an unfortunate series of coincidences, or maybe my anxiety was amplifying minor details into something sinister. Yet every time I catch a glimpse of a darkened street or receive another strangely timed text message, I can't help but feel that I'm being drawn into an obsessive plan, one that I never consented to be a part of. I'm left wondering if Daniel is merely a harmless, albeit overly attentive, individual with a knack for appearing when I'm most vulnerable, or if someone is truly tracking me, piecing together details of my life with unnerving precision. The unanswered questions linger, each encounter blurring the line between coincidence and deliberate surveillance. And so, as I lay awake in the silence of the night, I'm haunted by one chilling thought. Is this all just a series of eerie coincidences, or is there a stranger out there whose friendly face hides a far more dangerous intent? It started as an ordinary Tuesday. I woke up to the same sunbeam slanting through my window, the same creak of the old floorboard as I got out of bed, and the same cup of coffee I brewed every morning. But on this day, as I sat down at my kitchen table, I noticed something that made me pause. My mug, always a deep navy blue, was now a light, almost translucent shade of blue. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, still the same. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light and went about my routine. Later that morning, on my way to work, I passed by the corner bakery I'd frequented for years. The familiar neon sign flickered oddly, displaying not fresh breads daily, but for a split second, reset. I told myself it was a malfunction, nothing more than an electrical hiccup. Yet a subtle chill crept along my spine as I walked away. At work, things grew even stranger. I greeted my co-worker, Mark, who normally always wore a red tie, only to see him sporting a bright, inexplicable green one. When I asked him about it, he merely grinned and said, "Just trying something new," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But something in his smile didn't reach his eyes, and I began to feel a nagging sense of déjà vu. The most unnerving moment came that evening when I was returning home on the bus. I glanced out the window and caught sight of a woman I recognized, my old friend Lena, standing in the rain. I hadn't seen Lena in over a year, and yet there she was, staring directly at the bus with an expression that seemed to hold a secret message. I blinked, and when I looked again, she was gone. I later learned from a mutual friend that Lena had moved to another city months ago. Had I really seen her, or had the world just glitched? That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I began to notice the small details that didn't add up. The familiar hum of my refrigerator sounded off, as if it were humming a low, monotonous tune. My bookshelf, usually a chaotic jumble of paperbacks and novels, was meticulously organized, the books arranged in a sequence I couldn't remember ever choosing. I ran my fingers over the spines, and one title caught my eye, a book I was sure I had never owned, titled The Code of Repetition. I flipped through its pages, finding nothing but blank sheets where words should have been. The next few days unfolded like a loop. I'd leave my apartment, go through my usual routine, only to return and find subtle changes. A painting on the wall slightly rotated, the clock in the hallway displaying a time that made no sense, even as my phone's time remained normal. At times, I felt as if I were walking through a movie set where the background shifted just a bit each time I blinked. I'd catch glimpses of a flicker at the corner of my eye, a momentary ripple in reality, and then it would vanish, leaving me questioning whether it had been there at all. I began to record everything. I set up my phone to record my morning commute, my meals, even my quiet moments at home. But every playback revealed inexplicable repetitions. A pause in a conversation, a door closing twice in succession, the same snippet of a song playing in the background where there should have been silence. I noticed that every time I looked at my notes, some details were missing, erased as if by an unseen editor. The tipping point came one evening when, after a long day of trying to piece together the glitches, I sat in my living room and watched the clock tick. At exactly 9:17 p.m., time seemed to stutter. The seconds paused, held in a frozen frame, then jumped back a few moments before continuing as if nothing had happened. I felt as if the world had momentarily rewound itself, a reset of the natural order. My heart hammered as I tried to rationalize it, but logic offered no solace. I began to dread each day, terrified that the fabric of reality was fraying around me. I spoke with friends about it, but they laughed it off as stress or tired eyes. "Maybe you're just imagining things," they'd say, shaking their heads. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one who perceived the glitches, that I was trapped in a loop where the world was subtly rewriting itself. Late at night, when the house was silent, I sat by my desk and reread my journal. My handwriting was steady, but the words sometimes repeated as if I'd written them before. I found pages that were nearly identical, as if my thoughts were looping back on themselves. I tried to change my routine to break the cycle, but the anomalies persisted. Each morning, I'd wake up with a lingering sense of foreboding, convinced that something was very, very wrong. Now, as I type these words, the lights in my apartment flicker once more, and I can't help but wonder, is it all just a series of strange coincidences? A mind playing tricks on me? Or is it something far more unsettling, a glitch in the matrix of our shared reality? Every day, I feel the ground shift beneath my feet. Every moment seems to unravel, as if I'm caught in a repeating cycle I can't break free from. I'm not sure if I've become part of something much larger, a flawed simulation that's slowly breaking down, or if my mind is the only one out of sync with the rest of the world. All I know is that I'm no longer certain what is real, and every time I close my eyes, I fear that when I open them, the world will have shifted just a little more, leaving me stranded in a reality that is both familiar and disturbingly alien. I used to be a rational person, someone who trusted that every event had a logical explanation. That all changed one crisp October evening, and what I experienced still haunts me every day. It began as an ordinary night. I had just finished a long shift at the diner where I worked, and the drive home along our quiet suburban streets, lined with towering maples and neatly trimmed lawns, felt soothing after a hectic day. I parked in front of the small, aging house I'd inherited from my parents and settled in for what I assumed would be a peaceful night. As I sat in my favorite armchair reading, I noticed something odd. The family portrait on the mantel, a cherished snapshot of happier times, was slightly askew. I distinctly remembered straightening it that morning. I shrugged it off as a minor lapse in my memory and adjusted it again, but an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. Over the following days, inexplicable anomalies started to pile up. One morning, I found muddy footprints near my front door, small, deliberate prints that didn't match my shoes. I asked my neighbors if they had seen anyone lurking around, but they dismissed it as stray animals or a coincidence. Then, on another chilly morning, I discovered a neatly folded note on my doormat. It was typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, and it simply read, "I know." My heart pounded as I held the note, a cold dread seeping into my bones. I couldn't imagine who would know anything about me, let alone leave a message so cryptic. That very evening, while I was making dinner, I glanced out the kitchen window and saw a dark figure standing beneath the flickering street lamp by my front gate. The figure was motionless, as if frozen in time, yet I could feel its gaze boring into me. I hurried inside and double-locked every door, my hands trembling. I called a close friend to recount the sight, and while he tried to reassure me it was likely a local troublemaker, his tone held an edge of concern that only deepened my anxiety. The disturbances escalated rapidly after that. Late at night, I began hearing faint knocks on the windows. At first, they were so soft I questioned whether I was dreaming, but the rhythmic patterns soon became unmistakable. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I lay frozen, heart hammering, listening as the steps receded into silence. Unable to sleep, I sat in the darkness, straining to catch any further sound, convinced that someone was in my home. Desperate for answers, I installed security cameras around the house. When I reviewed the footage the next day, my blood ran cold. I caught glimpses of a shadow moving slowly along the hallway, and in one clip, I saw a door that I had firmly closed earlier in the evening gently creak open on its own. No one was ever seen entering or leaving, yet the evidence was undeniable. It was as if an unseen presence had been meddling with my belongings, rearranging them in ways I couldn't explain. One evening, I returned home after a particularly exhausting day at work to find my living room in utter disarray. Cushions were strewn across the floor, and objects were moved to places they didn't belong. On the coffee table lay a handwritten note, "You can't hide." The letters, scrawled in a hurried, desperate hand, sent shivers down my spine. I immediately called the police, but after a thorough search, They declared there was no sign of forced entry or any evidence of an intruder. Their dismissive attitude left me feeling isolated and increasingly terrified. As the nights wore on, the occurrences became even more relentless. I started noticing fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision, always vanishing when I turned to look directly. The oppressive sensation of being watched grew unbearable. Even with the lights on, I could almost feel a pair of eyes tracking my every move. My attempts to secure my home seemed futile, as if the very air was thick with an unseen presence that refused to be banished. The final, most terrifying incident came on a night I will never forget. I awoke abruptly to the sound of my front door slowly creaking open. Paralyzed by fear, I listened as a soft, raspy whisper, unintelligible yet laced with malice, drifted through the darkness, coming from just outside my bedroom door. I scrambled for the light, but the oppressive terror made every second feel like an eternity. When the sound finally ceased, I discovered a single black feather resting on my pillow, as if deliberately placed. That simple object confirmed what I had long feared. I was not alone, and someone or something was deliberately invading my life. Even now, months later, I live with the lingering terror of that autumn. I eventually moved out of that house, but the nightmares persist, and I find myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I step into dim corridors or quiet streets. I have spent countless hours searching for a rational explanation, sifting through old records, speaking to neighbors, even consulting paranormal experts, but no theory ever fits. There is no clear answer to why these events happened, no logical explanation for the presence that stalked me that night. I share this story not as a work of fiction, but as an account of a real, terrifying experience that defies all reason. Every detail is etched in my memory with the clarity of a waking nightmare. I still do not understand why I was targeted or what force was behind those sinister acts. The terror I endured was as real as the beating of my heart, and it left me with one overwhelming, unanswered question. Why? This is not a tale spun from imagination, but the harsh truth of a night when the normal turned inexplicably malevolent, leaving me to wonder if some mysteries in this world are meant to remain unsolved. I've always been in control of myself. At least, that's what I thought until a few months ago. It started with small things I could brush off as simple forgetfulness. I'd misplace my keys, forget whether I locked the door, or find a half-written email on my computer that I didn't remember starting. At first, I blamed stress, the long hours at work, the lack of sleep. But as the weeks went on, the gaps in my memory became longer, deeper, like something was hollowing out parts of my life without my permission. One evening, I sat down to watch TV after work, just like any other night. The next thing I knew, I was standing in my kitchen, the clock reading 3:47 a.m. My heart slammed against my ribs as I tried to piece together what had happened in the missing hours. My TV was off. My phone was still where I'd left it on the couch, but in my hand, I was holding a glass of water that I had no memory of getting. It was full to the brim, not a drop spilled, as if I had just poured it seconds before. That was the first time I truly felt it, the cold, creeping certainty that something was wrong, that it wasn't just forgetfulness. It was something else. The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy, but I could feel it watching me, just out of reach. I'd find myself halfway through writing a sentence in my journal, only to realize I had no idea what I was about to say. I'd wake up feeling unrest, my blankets tossed aside as if I had gotten up during the night. Then came the moments when my own reflection seemed unfamiliar, just slightly off, the tilt of my smile not quite my own, my eyes too distant, too hollow. One morning, I found a note on my desk. It was in my handwriting, but I didn't remember writing it. The words were simple, but they sent a sickening shiver through my body. You're doing great. Just keep going. I wanted to believe it was just a weird joke I had played on myself, something I had written while half asleep. But deep down, I knew I hadn't written it. Then the people around me started changing. I asked my coworker Mark about the project we had been working on together, and he stared at me like I was crazy. What project? He asked, confused. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but there was no humor in his eyes. We had spent weeks on it. I had emails, notes, proof. But when I checked my inbox, everything was gone. My notes were missing. The documents we had worked on were blank. And Mark didn't even remember ever working with me on it. I started testing reality, leaving small signs for myself, trying to catch the gaps before they swallowed me whole. I kept a journal, but some pages were inexplicably torn out. I set alarms on my phone at random times to snap me out of whatever was happening, but sometimes I'd check my phone only to find that I had dismissed them without remembering. And then came the worst night. I went to bed feeling exhausted, hoping, begging, for a full night's sleep. But when I woke up, I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in the middle of my living room, staring at the front door. The sun was just beginning to rise, a pale blue light creeping through the windows. I had no idea how long I had been standing there. My mouth was dry, my hands ice cold. Then I saw it. The door was unlocked. I always lock my door. Always. I could feel my pulse hammering in my skull as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating. Had I opened it? Had someone else? I looked down and saw something even worse. I was wearing different clothes than I had gone to bed in. My heart nearly stopped. My pajamas were in a crumpled heap on the couch, and I was wearing a hoodie and jeans, clothes I hadn't worn in days. Had I gone outside? I turned and saw my reflection in the dark TV screen. My breath caught in my throat. My face looked pale, thin or wrong, and then, just for a fraction of a second, I saw myself blink. But my real eyes hadn't moved. A jolt of cold terror flooded my veins. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. My reflection just stood there, still and waiting, until finally, it blinked in sync with me again. I spent the next few days in a fog, forcing myself to go through the motions of normal life, trying to ignore the gnawing certainty that something was very, very wrong. The gaps in my memory stretched wider. I'd wake up to find my phone in a different place. Emails I had sent had been rewritten. People would reference conversations I didn't remember having. One night, in a moment of desperate clarity, I set up my phone to record myself while I slept. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a sense of dread curling in my stomach. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and hit play. The first few hours were normal, just me sleeping, rolling over occasionally. But then, at 3:12 a.m., my body sat up. I wasn't awake. My eyes were still closed, but I sat up perfectly straight, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. I turned my head slowly, unnaturally, as if listening to something. Then, I started speaking. I couldn't hear the words, but my lips were moving, forming silent sentences, having a conversation with what? At 3:19 a.m., my eyes snapped open. I stared directly into the camera, directly at myself, and I smiled. Not a sleepy, confused smile. Not a groggy reaction to waking up. It was wide, knowing, deliberate. The video ended shortly after that, with me lying back down as if nothing had happened. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know how long it's been going on. I don't even know if it is me anymore. All I know is that every time I wake up, I feel a little less like myself, and a little more like something else is waking up in my body instead. And worst of all, I have the horrible, suffocating feeling that whatever it is, it doesn't want to leave. I've lived in the same neighborhood for over a decade, and nothing ever seemed to change. That was until about 6 months ago, when I moved into a slightly renovated apartment on Maple Avenue. At first, the changes were so minor I assumed they were just quirks of an old building. But as the days passed, I began to notice that familiar details no longer felt the same, even though everyone around me insisted nothing was wrong. It started with my living room. One morning I awoke to find my beloved armchair, always positioned perfectly beneath the window, moved a few inches to the left. I distinctly remembered placing it exactly where it had always been. I chalked it up to a heavy night's sleep and perhaps a misremembered position. But then, during a quiet evening watching television, I glanced at the bookshelf and saw that the order of my books had been subtly rearranged. A novel I had cherished was now nestled between two other titles, its spine misaligned. I checked the time. It was exactly when I'd left things the night before. Still, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The disturbances soon extended beyond the confines of my apartment. On my daily walks, I began to notice that certain landmarks appeared altered. The small park across the street, which I had visited countless times, now featured a new row of lampposts that hadn't been there yesterday. The familiar old oak tree, under which I'd often sat to read, looked strangely overpruned, its branches unnaturally bare. I mentioned these details to a neighbor I'd known for years, but she only smiled kindly and said, "It's all the same, dear. You're imagining things." That response did little to ease my mounting anxiety. At work, things grew even more unsettling. I shared my experiences with a close colleague, Tom, about how even our shared office seemed different. I described the way our meeting room's whiteboard was now filled with scribbles I didn't remember and how the coffee machine was positioned on a different counter than before. Tom's brow furrowed, and he told me, "You must be tired. I've never seen any of that." His denial, combined with the blank stares of others when I mentioned it in passing, made me question my own memory. Was it really happening, or was I simply losing my grip on reality? Late one night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I began noticing subtle changes in my own behavior. I'd catch myself repeating phrases in conversations that I didn't recall planning, and sometimes I'd find my hands empty when I was sure I'd been holding something. A phone, a pen, a piece of paper with a hastily scrawled message like "they are watching." I started keeping a journal, scribbling down every odd incident in the hope that I could piece together some logical explanation. Every entry, however, seemed to confirm that the world around me was shifting imperceptibly, as if an invisible hand was rearranging reality when I wasn't looking. One particularly disturbing incident occurred when I returned from work one rainy evening. I walked into my apartment and found the front door unlocked, a door I always made sure to bolt. I stepped inside cautiously, and everything seemed normal until I reached my study. There on my desk was a single envelope. Inside, in neat handwriting that I didn't recognize, was a short note. "Not all is as it seems." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I read it. I called my sister, who always reassured me that I was overreacting, but even she couldn't offer any explanation when I mentioned it. All I received was a gentle, "Maybe you're stressed, try not to let it get to you." But the changes only grew more frequent and disturbing. One afternoon, as I sat in the cafe near my apartment, one I had frequented for years, I saw a man I thought I recognized. He sat at the same table every day, reading the newspaper, and his face was one I had grown familiar with over many cups of coffee. Today, however, his eyes were red-rimmed and his smile was strained, and when I greeted him, he only mumbled something incoherent before returning to his paper. I mentioned it to the barista later, only to be told, "He's always like that. You must be seeing things differently now." I felt isolated, as if I were the only one witnessing a gradual unraveling of everything I once knew. I began to suspect that these changes were not random accidents, but part of something larger, a systemic alteration of reality itself. My apartment, my workplace, the familiar streets of my neighborhood, even my memories of how things had always been, were being subtly rewritten. The more I tried to piece together these glitches, the more I realized that every attempt to hold on to the old reality was met with something new and inexplicable. My journal filled with entries that painted a picture of a world in flux, a place where nothing was fixed and every moment carried the potential for something unsettling to appear. Now, I'm left with the haunting possibility that I'm trapped in a loop or an alternate version of reality, one that only I seem to perceive. Every time I try to confide in someone, they dismiss it as stress or a trick of the mind. But I know what I see. I see the subtle shifts in the way objects are arranged, the way people behave, and I feel it in the pit of my stomach, the feeling that I'm no longer living in the world I once knew. Every night, as I lie awake, I wonder if tomorrow the changes will be even more pronounced, if the very fabric of my life will be altered beyond recognition. I don't know if I'm imagining it all, or if there's something sinister at work behind these alterations. What I do know is that I'm increasingly convinced that the world around me is not as stable as it appears to everyone else. I fear that I've been left in a parallel existence, a reality that seems normal to everyone else, but feels completely alien and hostile to me. And so, I continued to watch, to record, and to wonder, hoping that one day I might find a clue, a way out, or at the very least, an explanation for this slow, creeping unraveling of everything I once trusted as real. I moved into the apartment on Elm Street in early autumn, thinking a fresh start in a new place might help me leave the past behind. The building was older, with creaking floors and a persistent, musty smell that I assumed was part of its charm. On my first day, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I arranged my few belongings in the sparse living room, placed my favorite armchair by the window, and even unpacked the old wooden bookshelf exactly where I remembered it being from the listing photos. It all felt like a blank slate, ready for me to imprint my life onto it. The first hint that something was off came a week later. I returned from work one evening and noticed that the armchair wasn't in its usual spot. I distinctly remembered positioning it by the window for the best view of the streetlights, but it was now tucked under the bookshelf in a dark corner. I stood there for a moment, blinking in disbelief, wondering if I'd simply forgotten that I'd moved it. Yet I was sure I hadn't touched it since that first day. I shrugged it off as my tired mind playing tricks on me and went to bed. Over the next few days, the changes became more subtle and frequent. One morning, I found a handwritten note on my kitchen table in a neat script that I didn't recognize. It read, "You're not alone." I felt a chill run down my spine, but when I mentioned it to the kindly old neighbor I'd met in passing, she insisted she hadn't seen anyone else around. I began to question my own memory. Was I really misplacing things, or was something else at work? One evening, after a long day at work, I came home expecting the familiar sight of my living room exactly as I'd left it. Instead, my bookshelf had shifted slightly to the left, and a picture frame I'd hung above the sofa was now turned sideways. The changes were small enough to be easily dismissed, but they happened repeatedly. I started keeping a mental checklist. Where was the armchair today? Had the picture been rotated again? Yet every time I checked, the items were not where I had last seen them. It was as if the apartment was rearranging itself when I wasn't looking. Then there were the moments that made me doubt my sanity. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard a faint rustling in the living room. I mustered the courage to get up and peek around the corner, only to see my coffee mug sitting on the table where it always belonged, except that it was now chipped with a small crack running along its side. I remembered buying that mug just last month, pristine and intact. I touched it gently, half expecting the crack to vanish, but it remained a silent testament to an alteration I couldn't explain. The situation escalated when I began noticing repetitions. I would leave the apartment for a few hours and return to find that certain objects had reverted to positions I distinctly remembered from earlier days, only to shift again when I wasn't looking. One afternoon, I saw the same neighbor standing on the street corner, greeting passersby in a way that felt oddly rehearsed, as if she were performing a role in a script that repeated over and over. I tried to ask her about it, but she only smiled and said, "It's just how things are here," as if that explained everything. At work, I began to see echoes of my home life. I'd have conversations with colleagues about mundane topics, what I'd had for lunch, plans for the weekend, but then on subsequent days, those same discussions would be recounted with different details, as if our memories had been subtly rewritten. I started to notice the same phrases repeated in emails and overheard them in casual conversations, like snippets of dialogue that I couldn't place. I felt increasingly isolated, as though I were the only one aware of the inexplicable shifts occurring around me. One particularly unsettling evening, I returned home after a stressful day and found my living room bathed in an eerie, unchanging light. Every object was arranged in the exact same configuration I'd seen that morning. I walked slowly around the room, expecting to catch a glimpse of something different. A picture tilted a little, a cushion moved a fraction of an inch, but nothing had changed. It was as if time had frozen in that moment, only for it to resume later when I wasn't looking. I began to suspect that these glitches weren't random. They were deliberate, part of a pattern I was powerless to control. I started recording video of my apartment, hoping to capture proof of the alterations. In one clip, I watched in disbelief as the armchair slid imperceptibly across the floor when I wasn't looking. In another, I saw the note on the kitchen table disappear and then reappear with a new message scrawled beneath it. You cannot escape. Each recording left me more unnerved, convinced that my life was being manipulated by forces beyond my understanding. Now, as I write this, I sit in the same apartment that once felt like home, but it no longer does. Every object, every familiar detail, carries the weight of a hidden message, a secret I cannot decode. I have tried to leave, to start fresh in another place, but wherever I go, I can't shake the feeling that I'm slipping between realities. The glitches continue, small at first, then growing larger until I feel like I'm trapped in a loop where every moment is both new and exactly the same as the last. I am not sure if I'm losing my mind or if the world around me has fractured into an alternate reality, a closed loop that resets and rearranges itself without warning. All I know is that something is deeply wrong, and I may never be able to return to the comforting predictability of the life I once knew. Every night, as I lie in bed, I wonder if tomorrow I will awaken to a version of this apartment that is entirely unrecognizable. And with that thought, I am left to confront the terrifying possibility that reality itself may be nothing more than an illusion, a program that I have become hopelessly entangled in, with no way out. I moved into the little apartment on Birch Street in early November, hoping a change of scenery would help me shake off the stresses of a long, exhausting year. The place was modest, bare walls, creaking hardwood floors, and a persistent chill that seeped in despite the central heating. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary, if a bit worn down by time. I spent my first few days unpacking, arranging my few belongings, and trying to settle into a routine. But soon, I began noticing things that I couldn't quite explain. It started with small, almost trivial details. One morning, I reached into my jacket pocket for my wallet, only to find it missing. I retraced my steps, checked every corner of the apartment, and even questioned the possibility that I might have left it in the taxi the previous night. Yet when I finally found it inexplicably on the kitchen table where I had never placed it, a nagging feeling told me that something was off. Then, on another day, I noticed that my favorite mug, the one with a chip on the rim that I cherished for sentimental reasons, had shifted from its usual spot on the sideboard to the windowsill. I could have sworn I hadn't touched it since I'd set it down that morning. At first, I chalked these oddities up to my own absent-mindedness. Perhaps I was more tired than I realized. But soon, the changes grew too consistent to dismiss. I began finding small, unfamiliar marks on the walls near the doorway. A series of light scratches, almost like claw marks, that weren't there when I'd first moved in. One evening, as I was watching television, I glanced at the bookshelf and saw that a book I had placed there the previous day was now lying on the floor, its spine cracked open, as if someone had rifled through it. My heart pounded, and I hurried to pick it up, but the book's pages were scattered, and the marks on the wall seemed to have deepened. I tried to mention these incidents to my neighbors when I bumped into them in the narrow hallway, but they offered only polite smiles and vague reassurances that everything was normal. When I confided in my sister over the phone, she suggested I was just stressed and paranoid after the move. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deliberately altering my environment, making small changes that added up to something far more sinister. One night, I awoke to a soft rustling sound coming from the living room. I lay in bed, straining to listen, convinced that perhaps someone had broken in. When I finally mustered the courage to investigate, I found nothing amiss. Everything appeared as it should, yet my favorite mug was now absent from its usual spot. In its place lay a crumpled piece of paper with a single sentence scribbled in shaky handwriting. "It's only the beginning." I froze, heart hammering, uncertain whether to call the police or tear the note up and pretend it hadn't happened. I chose silence, hoping that if I ignored it, the unsettling events might cease. The disturbances escalated subtly over the following weeks. I began to notice that time itself seemed to warp around me. I'd leave the apartment for a brief walk and return to find that the layout of my furniture had subtly changed, as if I had stepped into a slightly different version of my home. A vase that always sat on the coffee table was sometimes found on the mantel, its water long evaporated, while a lamp would be turned off when I distinctly remembered leaving it on. Even my own memories started to betray me. I recalled clearly placing objects in one location, only to find them in another when I returned. Every attempt to rationalize the glitches led to more questions, and the more I tried to piece together the puzzle, the more I felt that something was orchestrating these changes. At work, things weren't immune to the phenomenon. During a routine meeting, I mentioned an upcoming deadline that my colleagues all seemed to know about, except for one coworker who looked at me blankly. When I asked him if he'd heard any details, he shook his head, claiming nothing had been discussed. Later that day, I overheard another colleague reference a conversation we'd supposedly had last week, one that I had no recollection of ever taking place. It was as if my personal timeline was being edited, with moments appearing and disappearing at random. My sense of reality began to blur. I started wondering if I was the only one affected by these inexplicable shifts, or if I was somehow slipping into a parallel existence. Desperation and dread took root inside me. I began keeping a meticulous journal, recording every instance of an out-of-place object, every strange mark on the walls, and every conversation that seemed altered in hindsight. The entries became increasingly frantic, filled with timestamps and details that only deepened my confusion. One entry read, 10:45 p.m. The door is unlocked. I don't remember leaving it open. Another said, 2:30 a.m. Woke up to find a note on my pillow. You were seen. Each new anomaly was like a thread in a larger, dark tapestry that I couldn't unravel. And with every thread I pulled, I felt a tightening grip on my sense of normalcy. Late one night, when the apartment was shrouded in darkness and the silence was broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator, I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the unsettling evidence of these disturbances. I felt an overwhelming presence, as if someone or something was watching from just beyond the reach of my vision. I stood, hesitated, and slowly approached the bookshelf. There, carved into the wood, were symbols I had never seen before, intricate and precise, as if etched by a steady hand. I ran my fingers over them, half expecting the marks to vanish under my touch, but they remained cold and permanent. In that moment, I realized with a sinking dread that I was not just experiencing random coincidences. These changes were deliberate, part of a larger, inexplicable system that I couldn't comprehend. I felt trapped in a loop, caught between the reality I remembered and a distorted version that was being rewritten before my eyes. No one believed me. Every time I tried to explain, I was met with polite dismissals or concerned pity. I began to fear that if I spoke too loudly about what I was experiencing, I might vanish like the missing keys and shifted objects. I don't know if I'm losing my grip on sanity or if something truly malevolent is at work behind the scenes. Every night, as I lie in bed, I wonder if tomorrow I'll wake up in a world that is completely unrecognizable, a place where even my own memories are nothing but fragments of a manipulated narrative. I can't shake the feeling that I'm part of a story that's still being written, one where the lines between what's real and what's fabricated have all but dissolved. I share this account not to frighten you, though I know it does, but in the desperate hope that someone out there might understand. Was it all just my imagination? A series of unfortunate coincidences born from stress and isolation? Or is there something far more sinister behind these changes? A force that delights in bending reality to its will? I have no answers. Only the lingering sense that I'm being watched, that my life is not entirely my own, and that every small, inexplicable glitch is a whisper from something beyond our understanding. And every night, I lie awake wondering if I'll ever wake up to the world I once knew, or if it has already been erased, replaced by a puzzle I can't solve.